She had spent $4 million building the most advanced private performance facility in the state, and not a single one of her engineers could tell her why her car was dying. 6 weeks, 11 specialists, 3 factory engineers flown in from Stuttgart, and every single diagnostic screen kept flashing the same maddening green, no fault detected. But Vanessa Sterling knew what she heard. She felt it, that split-second hesitation at 8,000 revolutions per minute, like the engine was choking on a secret. Then a single dad showed up with a beat-up red toolbox and fixed it in 5 minutes. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story travels. Hit like, and stay with me until the end. You won't believe where this goes. The morning it all started, Vanessa Sterling wasn't supposed to be at the facility at all. She had a board meeting at 9, a conference call with her Singapore partners at 11, and somewhere in between, a lunch she'd already mentally canceled with an investor who talked too much and listened too little. Her assistant had color-coded the entire day in the calendar app on her phone. Navy blue for non-negotiables, red for the things she'd rescheduled twice already. But at 6:15 in the morning, before the first cup of coffee had even finished brewing in the facility's kitchen, Vanessa was already in the garage bay with her hands on the hood of a 2023 Porsche 911 GT 3RS, wearing a pair of fitted dark jeans, her hair pulled into a loose braid, and an expression on her face that her employees had learned over the years to treat as a weather warning. The car was extraordinary. Even standing still, it looked like it was doing 90. The shark blue metallic paint caught the early light coming through the bay's high windows and threw it back like it was showing off. The carbon fiber accents, the massive rear wing, the wide body stance, every inch of it was engineered aggression. It was a machine that cost $320,000 and deserved every cent. Vanessa had bought it 8 months ago. She had driven it exactly 14 times on the private track she'd had built behind the facility, a 2.3-mile circuit that wound through the hills like a ribbon of dark ribbon through green velvet. 12 of those 14 runs had been perfect, the kind of perfect that made a person feel, briefly, like physics was a negotiation rather than a law. The other 2 runs had felt wrong. Not catastrophically wrong. Not pull over and call for help wrong. More like the engine hiccuped. A stumble. A fraction of a second, somewhere in the upper rev range, where the power delivery just broke in a way it shouldn't have. Where something that should have been seamless got a seam in it. The first time, she told herself it was her imagination. The second time, she called the shop. Marcus Webb had been Vanessa's head of service operations for 3 years. He was 44, meticulous, and had once spent 6 hours arguing with a factory rep about torque specifications on a bearing assembly. He did not take shortcuts. He did not guess. He was the kind of man who, when presented with a problem, built a spreadsheet before he even touched a wrench. When Vanessa told him what she'd felt, Marcus had nodded slowly, the way he always did when he was already calculating something in the back of his head. "When you say it stumbles," he said, "you mean like a misfire?" "No, not like a misfire." She'd tried to explain it twice already and was already frustrated with the limits of language. "It's more like the engine takes a breath it wasn't supposed to take, right at the top of the rev range. 8, maybe 8,500 RPM. 1 second it's pulling, the next second it's not pulling. Then it comes back. Duration? Half a second. Less, maybe." Marcus had written something in his notebook, then looked up. "I'll run it through the system today." The system in this case was a diagnostic suite that Vanessa had paid over $200,000 to install. It wasn't the same tool the dealerships used. It was better. Factory-level access, live telemetry, integrated with the OBD port in a way that let the software read not just fault codes but microsecond-level data from every sensor in the engine management system. Fuel injector pulse width, throttle response curves, air-fuel ratio at every point in the rev range, knock sensor activity, cam timing, all of it in real time, while the car was running on a dynamometer that could simulate everything short of actual track G-forces. The first diagnostic run came back clean. Marcus showed Vanessa the readout the next morning. Every parameter inside the specified range. No fault codes logged, no anomalies. The engine management system had no record of any irregularity. Vanessa looked at the readout for a long moment. "Run it again," she said. He ran it again. Same result. She ran the car herself on the track 2 days later, specifically trying to replicate the fault. She found it, same place, same RPM range, that same fractional stumble, and came back into the bay with her jaw tight and her eyes flat and said quietly, "It's still there. I'm going to need you to find it." Marcus nodded. And that was the beginning of 6 weeks that would test everyone in that facility. Week 1 was internal. Marcus went through the car's ignition system by hand, inspecting each coil pack, testing spark plug resistance, checking wiring harness integrity. He replaced 2 plugs that showed marginal wear, even though they were within spec, because marginal wear was still wear. The car went back on the dyno. The fault remained. Week 2, Marcus brought in Rafael Torres, a tuner who had built a reputation in the track day community for diagnosing drivability issues that dealers couldn't touch. Rafael was from Houston, drove a lifted pickup truck, and had a habit of clicking his teeth when he was thinking. He spent 2 full days with the car, remapped the fuel injection tables slightly, ran the engine at high load for sustained periods, studied the data logs with an intensity that Vanessa, watching from the mezzanine above the shop, almost found reassuring. Rafael came to her office on the 3rd day. "I can't reproduce a consistent fault signature in the data," he said. "The air-fuel ratio is clean. Ignition timing's clean. I'm not seeing anything that should cause a drivability complaint." "And yet," Vanessa said. "And yet," Rafael agreed. He at least had the decency not to suggest she was imagining it. "I'll tell you what I think. I think there might be something intermittent happening with the intake. Could be a resonance issue. Certain RPM bands can create pressure waves that... Can you find it?" A pause. "Not with what I have here." She thanked him for his time, wrote him a check, watched his truck pull out of the lot. Week 3 brought in a woman named Dr. Priya Okonkwo, who held an engineering doctorate from MIT and consulted for 3 different motorsport programs. She had precise, careful hands and spoke in complete sentences that were so well organized they almost had footnotes. She ran acoustic analysis on the intake manifold, used ultrasonic scanning equipment to check for microfractures in the composite intake runners, and spent an afternoon with a borescope inspecting the throttle body. She found nothing. Her report was 12 pages long and thorough and concluded, with careful academic language, that the vehicle appeared to be operating within factory specifications. Vanessa read the entire report, then read it again, then set it on her desk and stared at the wall for a while. By week 4, word had gotten around, in the discreet way that word gets around in tight-knit performance communities, that Vanessa Sterling's GT3 RS had a ghost in it. The phrasing was meant to be funny. Vanessa didn't find it funny. She flew in a factory engineer from Porsche's development center. His name was Klaus. He was 51 years old, and he had spent 26 of those years working specifically on the 9000 series flat-6 engine family. If anyone alive understood the GT3 RS's engine, it was Klaus. Klaus spent 3 days at the facility. He was thorough, methodical, and impeccably professional. He replaced the fuel pressure regulator. He recalibrated the throttle position sensors. He inspected the engine's variable valve timing system with a level of care that suggested he considered it a personal responsibility. Then he sat down across from Vanessa in her office, folded his hands on the table, and said in lightly accented English, "Miss Sterling, I have inspected this vehicle very carefully. Every component is within specification. The software is current. I cannot identify a fault." Vanessa was quiet for a moment. "What about the intake system?" she said. "I inspected it thoroughly." "What about micro leaks? Anything too small for the sensors to catch?" Klaus had been patient and professional throughout the visit, but something in his expression just for a moment shifted, the way a teacher's expression shifts when a student asks the same question for the 4th time. "The sensors on this vehicle are very sensitive. If there were a meaningful air leak in the intake system, the engine management system would log it. Would it, though? If the leak was small enough? Small enough to be below sensor threshold would mean small enough to have no meaningful impact on performance." Vanessa looked at him. "Then why does it stumble?" Klaus looked back. "I cannot explain a phenomenon I cannot measure. My professional assessment is that this vehicle is performing correctly. He was perfectly polite when he said it. He was also clearly done. Week 5 was when Marcus sat down with Vanessa and had the conversation she'd been dreading. They were in the facility's small conference room, not her main office, which was up a flight of stairs and had floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the track. This was the working room, where the actual decisions got made. A rectangular table, a whiteboard covered in diagrams that had been partially erased and redrawn, a coffee maker on a folding table in the corner that had been there since the facility opened and that Vanessa had somehow never replaced. Marcus had a folder in front of him. He opened it, then closed it, seemed to be choosing words. "I want to be straight with you," he said. "I prefer it that way. We've had 5 separate diagnostic assessments on this vehicle. Factory-level hardware, factory-certified personnel. I've personally reviewed every data log we've captured. In 6 weeks of testing, we have not captured a single logged anomaly." He paused. "The car, by every objective measurement we have available, is performing correctly." Vanessa was quiet. "I know that's not what you want to hear," Marcus continued. "And I'm not saying you didn't feel something. I'm not dismissing that. But I have to be honest, I'm out of options. I don't know where else to look." "You're telling me to accept it." "I'm telling you that professionally, I don't know how to chase something that leaves no trace in the data." There was a long silence. Outside, through the walls, Vanessa could faintly hear one of the technicians in the shop. The sound of an air ratchet, stop, start, stop, start. "What would you do?" she said finally. "If it was your car?" Marcus thought about it. He was the kind of man who actually thought about things before answering, which was part of why she'd hired him. "Honestly, at this point, I'd probably accept it was within normal variation and move on." Vanessa stood up. "Okay," she said. Marcus looked almost relieved. "I'm not going to do that," Vanessa continued, picking up her coffee cup. "But thank you for being honest with me." Marcus closed his folder, said nothing more. He'd expected as much. It would be easy, from the outside, to see Vanessa Sterling as the kind of person she appeared to be. 30 years old, 9 figures in the bank, a private performance facility, a $300,000 car she was having a principled argument with. Easy to see her as someone whose problems were abstract, whose stakes were aesthetic, who had more money than proportion. The reality was more complicated and less flattering to that narrative. Vanessa had grown up in Tempe, Arizona, in a house where the question, "Can we afford it?" wasn't rhetorical. Her mother had worked dispatch for a regional trucking company. Her father had repaired HVAC systems until his back gave out, and then had worked the front desk at an auto parts store for 11 years. They weren't poor, not technically, but the math of their lives had always been close. Every large purchase was a negotiation. Every unexpected expense was a small crisis. What she'd learned growing up in that house was this: when something is wrong with a machine, you don't ignore it. You find out what's wrong. You fix it. Because if you don't fix the thing that's wrong, it becomes something worse. A loose belt becomes a broken engine. A small leak becomes a ruined interior. A problem ignored becomes a problem that costs 3 times as much later. Her father had taught her that. Not as a life lesson, not as philosophy, just as practical fact, delivered while they stood together in a driveway on a Saturday morning, the hood of the family's 2003 Civic up, her father with a flashlight and a look of patient concentration on his face. "You hear that?" he'd say. "That ticking, right there." And she would listen, and eventually she would hear it. Something subtle, rhythmic, irregular at the edges. "What is it?" she would ask. "Doesn't matter yet what it is. First you hear it, then you find it, then you fix it." She'd built the performance facility 6 years ago, when the tech acquisition that made her first $100 million had cleared, and she'd spent 3 weeks trying to figure out what she actually wanted to do with money rather than accumulate it. Cars were the answer, not as status symbols, not as investments, though they'd turned out to be both, but as machines, as problems to understand, as things that, when they were right, were genuinely extraordinary. And when her GT3 RS was wrong, even a little wrong, even in a way that 6 engineers couldn't measure, it bothered her at a level that had nothing to do with the money. It bothered her the same way a loose belt bothered her father. She knew what she'd heard. She trusted her own senses, And she was not going to let someone, anyone, tell her that what she'd felt wasn't real. Week 6 started with Marcus suggesting, gently, that they bring the car to the official Porsche dealer for a fresh set of eyes. Not because he expected different results, he'd essentially told her as much, but because it would create a formal service record that might be useful if the fault ever manifested dramatically enough to pursue under warranty. Vanessa said she'd think about it. She didn't think about it. Instead, she spent 3 days driving herself quietly into a wall of frustration, reviewing reports she'd already reviewed, watching videos she'd taken of the car on track, and trying to pinpoint exactly where in the footage the fault was happening. She could see it. Barely. A blip in the RPM readout on the data overlay. Barely a blip. But it was there. It was there. She was in her office on Thursday afternoon, the reports open across her second monitor, and a glass of water she'd forgotten to drink going warm on her desk, when her personal phone rang. The number on screen was an old one, not in her contacts anymore, but stored somewhere in the deep sediment of memory that you never quite clear out. Danny Reyes. She'd met him at an SCCA event in Phoenix almost 4 years ago, back when she was still occasionally running amateur track days rather than the private circuit. He'd been fast in a stripped-down Miata and made her laugh at dinner afterward, and they'd stayed in contact the way people do. Sporadically, through shared interest rather than genuine closeness. She picked up partly because the interruption was welcome. "Vanessa, hey, I've been reading on the forum about your GT3 situation." She closed her eyes briefly. Of course it was on the forum. "It's been a long 6 weeks, Danny." "Yeah, I heard. I actually wanted to call about something, but I wasn't sure if it was... I don't know. I didn't want to waste your time." "You have my attention for the next 30 seconds. "Okay." She could hear him take a breath. "There's a guy, a mechanic. Okay, here's the thing. He's not fancy. He doesn't have a big shop or any kind of big reputation. He runs a small repair place out in Denton, mostly regular cars, nothing exotic. But I saw him diagnose a drivability issue on a customer's M3 last spring that 2 dealers and a BMW specialist couldn't figure out. Same kind of thing you're describing. No fault codes, intermittent, only happened at high load. And he found it in no time. Basically no time." "What was it?" "A vacuum leak. Tiny. In the intake. They'd replaced the intake manifold gasket and missed a hairline crack in the plastic of the manifold itself. Nobody caught it with normal diagnostic equipment." Vanessa was very still. "How did he find it?" she said. "He listened to the engine, didn't even touch the computer, just listened." A beat of silence. "What's his name?" "Ethan Cole." She wrote it down, though she wasn't sure why. She had no intention of bringing an unknown mechanic from a small shop in Denton anywhere near her $300,000 car. But she wrote it down. She told herself she was just going to look him up. Credentials, background, nothing more. She found him on a business directory, Cole's Automotive, established 7 years ago, located in a strip of low commercial buildings off a secondary road outside Denton. The website looked like it had been built in 2019 and updated approximately never. There was a bio page with a photo. A man in his early 30s, dark hair, an easy expression, wearing a denim shirt with the sleeves rolled up. The kind of face that didn't try to convince you of anything. The bio said he'd been working on cars since he was 12, that his late father had run the shop before him, that he specialized in finding the problems the other guys miss. There were 8 Google reviews, all 5 stars. One said simply, "Ethan fixed my car in an hour after 3 shops told me nothing was wrong. I don't know how he does it, but I trust him completely." Vanessa read that review 3 times. Then she called Danny back. "Do you have his number?" She almost didn't call. She drafted the call in her head twice, decided against it, then decided to do it because, at minimum, it would close off an avenue and let her feel like she'd been thorough. That was the story she told herself. The phone rang twice. Cole's Automotive. The voice was even, unhurried. The kind of voice that belonged to someone who didn't have to perform being calm. Someone who just was. "Hi, my name is Vanessa Sterling. I was referred to you by a mutual acquaintance, Danny Reyes. I have a diagnostic issue with a vehicle that several certified specialists have been unable to resolve, and I wanted to... The GT3RS, the voice said. She stopped. I'm sorry? Danny mentioned it might be a GT3, the thing where it stumbles at high RPM. He told you about it. He mentioned it. A pause. It's an interesting problem. Have you worked on a GT3RS before? No? She'd expected that. The specialists I've had on it are factory certified for this specific platform. They have access to the factory diagnostic system. They've spent weeks on this car and can't find the fault. What does the car sound like when it stumbles? She hadn't expected that question. Not as a first question, not as any of the first 5 questions. Like, it breaks, she said, before she could frame it better. The delivery just breaks. It's pulling, and then it's not, and then it is again. Does it sound like it's pulling air somewhere it shouldn't? The room was quiet for a second. Yes, she said slowly. Actually, yes. That's the closest anyone's come to describing it. She heard him exhale. Not dramatically, just a small sound of someone thinking. I could take a look, he said. I'm not making you any promises. And you should know I'll probably want to just listen to it run before I look at anything else. I know that probably sounds, when can you come? Another pause. A short one. I've got a situation here in the mornings. I can come Saturday, but I'd need to leave by 3. That works. Okay. He didn't ask about rates, didn't ask for more background, didn't try to impress her or establish credibility. I'll text you the address, Vanessa said. See you Saturday, Ethan said. He arrived at 8:47 a.m., which was 13 minutes late, which bothered her more than it should have. The vehicle he arrived in was a 2011 Ford F-150 in a silver that had faded to something closer to gray. One of the rear bumper corners had a ding in it. The truck was clean, though. Not washed for company clean, just a truck that had been lived in carefully. He got out carrying a toolbox, not a professional rolling chest, not an organized modular system. A toolbox was red metal, the old kind, with a tray that lifts when you open the lid and a bottom compartment for the larger stuff. It was worn in a way that implied it had been used for decades. Several of the corner edges had been worn bright, where the paint had gone away. Vanessa was standing at the entrance to the main bay when he walked up. She watched him take in the facility, the high ceiling, the track lighting, the 5 vehicles in the bays, the diagnostic rigs, the clean concrete floor. He didn't look overwhelmed or impressed. He looked like someone who was orienting himself. He was about her height, maybe an inch taller, the same denim shirt from the website photo, or one like it. Dark circles under his eyes, faintly. A man who hadn't slept enough. For the kind of reasons people don't sleep enough that have nothing to do with work. Mr. Cole, she said. Ethan. He shifted the toolbox to his left hand and offered his right. His grip was firm, not performative. Sorry I'm a bit late. Morning routine took longer than expected. How far did you drive? About 90 minutes. She'd been up since 5. He'd been up earlier, clearly. Marcus appeared from behind one of the bays, wiping his hands on a shop towel. He looked at Ethan, then at the toolbox, then at Vanessa, with the expression of a man who wanted to say something and had decided, professionally, not to. Marcus, Vanessa said, this is Ethan Cole. He's going to take a look at the GT3. Marcus nodded, extended a hand. Marcus Webb, head of service operations. He shook Ethan's hand. I can pull up the diagnostic history if you want to get an overview before. I appreciate that, Ethan said, but I'd actually like to hear it first, before I look at any of the reports. Marcus's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. Hear it. Just let it run. Get a sense of it. There was a pause. Marcus looked at Vanessa. Vanessa gave him nothing. Marcus turned back to Ethan. Sure, he said, in the tone of a man who was being professional. Ethan set his toolbox down, not in the way, just out of it. And then he stood next to the GT3 while Marcus started it and let it idle. The GT3 RS idle was something in its own right. At low RPM, a naturally aspirated flat 6 of this caliber produced a sound that was dense and slightly rough, the valvetrain clatter mixed with the intake breathing, a mechanical complexity that electronic intervention had made cleaner but not eliminated. It was a voice, in the way that any sufficiently complex machine has a voice. Ethan stood next to it and listened, not in a performative way. He wasn't closing his eyes or putting his hand to his ear. He just stood there, weight even on both feet, and was quiet and listened. After about 30 seconds, he crouched down next to the passenger side of the car, near the front wheel arch, and stayed there for another minute without moving. Marcus was watching from 8 feet away, arms loosely crossed. 2 of the facility's technicians, young guys, mid-20s, one of them named Tyler, who had a degree in automotive technology, had drifted to the edge of their bays, pretending to work on something nearby. Vanessa stood back, near the bench along the wall. She didn't hover. She'd learned, a long time ago, that hovering over someone working was both annoying and useless. But she watched. Ethan stood up, circled around to the driver's side, crouched again, stood, walked to the front of the car and looked at the engine bay for about 15 seconds, then turned to Marcus. "Can you bring it to partial load? Hold it around 4,500 RPM for me. Don't let it go above 6. Marcus looked at him for a moment, then got in the car and followed the instruction. The engine rose in pitch, held. The exhaust note changed character, fuller, more purposeful, a sound that had an edge to it that the idle didn't have. Ethan crouched at the front of the car, this time lower, close to the front fascia. He stayed there for almost a full minute. Then he moved to the passenger side again, near the intake side of the engine, and something changed in his face. Vanessa saw it. Just a small thing, a slight tightening around his eyes, a stillness that was different from the previous stillness. Not excitement, not confidence. Something quieter than that. The look of someone who'd heard a word they recognized in a language they understood. "Okay," he said. "Let it come down." Marcus brought the engine back to idle, looked at Ethan over the roof of the car. "There's air going somewhere it shouldn't," Ethan said. "On the intake side. It's small. You can just barely hear it against the rest of the noise when you get the airflow moving through there. It almost disappears at idle." The bay was quiet for a moment. Even the 2 technicians who'd been pretending to work had stopped pretending. Marcus was very still. "We've run intake pressure diagnostics on this car." "I'm sure you have." Ethan said it without edge. "Sensor-based diagnostics can miss leaks below a certain threshold because the ECU compensates for the air-fuel deviation before it logs it. If the leak is small enough, the fuel trims absorb the difference and nothing flags." He paused. "The engine's working to fix it. That's why it takes high load and high RPM for it to show up. That's when the compensation can't keep up anymore." Marcus's jaw tightened, just slightly. "That's what you're hearing?" Vanessa said. "Yeah." Ethan looked at her. "That's what I'm hearing. I'd want to get eyes on the intake before I say anything more specific, but that's what I think it is." She almost told him to go ahead. She almost just said yes, find it. But something stopped her. A residual professional caution, or maybe just the weight of 6 weeks of experts telling her nothing was wrong. She looked at Marcus. Marcus said, "Mr. Cole, I respect your read, but we've had several very experienced people over this car's intake system, including a factory engineer with 26 years on this engine family. If there was an intake leak, how did they check it?" Ethan said. Marcus paused. "Pressure test, visual inspection, bore scope on the throttle body. Did anyone do a smoke test?" A beat. "A smoke test introduces pressurized smoke into the intake system and you look for where it escapes," Ethan said, not condescendingly, just explanatory. "It's a more sensitive detection method for microleaks than pressure testing because you're looking for physical evidence rather than pressure drop." The technician named Tyler, still hovering at the edge of his bay, made a sound that might have been the beginning of saying something. He caught Marcus's eye and stopped. Marcus looked at Vanessa. Something in his expression, not defeat, not quite, but the look of a man doing a mental inventory. "We didn't run a smoke test," Marcus said finally. The words landed in the room quietly. Vanessa said, "Why not?" Marcus didn't answer immediately, and the not answering was its own kind of answer. Because they hadn't run a smoke test Because a smoke test was a technique used for finding small vacuum leaks in older, simpler vehicles. And nobody working on a brand new 911 GT3 RS with state-of-the-art onboard diagnostics had thought to reach for a tool that felt, by comparison, almost antique. "Do we have a smoke machine?" Vanessa said. Tyler, from his bay, said quietly, "I have one. In my tool chest." Tyler retrieved the smoke machine. It was a commercial unit, not cheap, the kind used for EVAP system testing. A yellow housing, a hand pump, inlet and outlet ports. It had been in the shop for 2 years as part of a general diagnostic toolkit and had been used maybe a dozen times. Ethan connected it to the intake system. He'd pulled a section of the upper intake hose free to get access to a good port, working without hurry, his movements methodical and unhesitant. He knew the anatomy of an intake system, not the specific anatomy of a GT3 RS, but the general architecture, the principles. He introduced smoke. For about 40 seconds, nothing was visible. Then, on the passenger side of the engine bay, near where the intake manifold met one of the secondary runners, a seam that was recessed, angled slightly away from direct view, a thin wisp of white appeared. Not much, just a thread of it, barely visible against the engine bay's dark components. Marcus saw it at the same time Ethan did. Ethan was already reaching in, not with a diagnostic tool but with his hand, feeling along the runner to the joint. His fingers found a hose clamp. He pressed against it, felt the very slight give that a properly seated clamp wouldn't have. "There it is," he said. Not triumphant, just matter of fact. He reached into the toolbox. The wrench he pulled out was old, the kind of old that meant decades. A combination wrench, 10 millimeters. Its surface worn in the specific way of tools that have been used 10,000 times. The corners of the hex had gone soft with use. It was the kind of tool that should have been retired and hadn't been, for reasons that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with sentiment. He set it on the clamp, turned it, not dramatically, not with force, just a quarter turn, a third of a turn, felt it seat, pulled the smoke machine supply hose free, reconnected the intake system, looked at Marcus. "Fire it up," he said. The engine started, rose. Marcus, in the driver's seat, brought it up through the rev range, 4,000, 5, 6, 7. The exhaust cracking and pulling, the air intake roaring on the right side of the engine bay, 8,000 revolutions per minute. The engine singing at a pitch that made the walls of the facility feel like they were leaning in. No stumble. Marcus held it there. Let it breathe. Brought it down. Back up. Full sweep. Smooth. Completely, absolutely smooth. He let the engine settle back to idle. Got out of the car, stood next to it for a moment without saying anything. The shop was very quiet. Tyler, still holding the smoke machine, said, in a voice barely above a breath, "That was it. That was actually it." Marcus turned to look at Ethan. He had the expression of a man who was processing two competing things, something that might have been humility and something that was definitely uncomfortable. He was not a man who accepted being wrong easily, not because he was arrogant, but because he was the kind of professional who had built his entire identity around being right, around thoroughness, around not missing things. He'd missed this. "A loose clamp," Marcus said. His voice was level, but the levelness cost him something. "It happens," Ethan said. He didn't pile on. "Factory assembly lines are moving fast. Torque specifications get followed, but vibration loosens things over time, especially in that part of the intake. The secondary runner junction sees a lot of thermal cycling." It was generous. Whether it was true was secondary. Marcus nodded once. Vanessa had been standing at the side of the bay throughout all of it, at the position she always took when she was watching someone work. Slightly back, slightly to the side, where she could see without being in the way. She had not said a word for the last 15 minutes. She said something now. "Ethan." He turned to look at her. 6 weeks, she said. "It took you—" She glanced at her watch. 40 minutes. He looked slightly uncomfortable with that framing. "I had a lot of people's work to build on. All those reports established what it wasn't." "Don't be modest." He almost smiled. It was a complicated expression, not quite defensive, not quite pleased. I've been doing this for a while. I know how to listen to engines. That's about all it was. That was not about all it was, Vanessa said. Bon. The rest of the morning had an odd texture to it. Vanessa sent for coffee. Ethan stayed while Marcus re-inspected the clamp area, confirmed the repair, ran the car through another full diagnostic cycle to establish a clean baseline. Tyler ran it on the track, a single out and back, less than 2 miles, and came back shaking his head slowly in a way that meant it was perfect. Marcus and Ethan talked during all of it. Not warmly at first. Marcus was not a man who became warm quickly, especially not with someone who just demonstrated a gap in his process. But professionally, technically. Marcus asked detailed questions about intake leak detection and the smoke testing method. Ethan answered without any evident need to make Marcus feel bad about it. They were two people who cared about the same things: the machine, the truth of it, finding the actual problem. And eventually that common ground was enough. At one point, Vanessa overheard Ethan say, "The factory engineers were looking at what the sensors were telling them, which is what you do. That's the right starting point. But sensors report what they can measure, and sometimes the failure mode is in the gap between what they can measure." Marcus said, "You went straight to the gap." "I started with the sound," Ethan said. "The sound was telling me something was in the gap before I knew what the gap was." Marcus nodded slowly. "Your father taught you that?" A pause. "Yeah," Ethan said. "He did." Vanessa paid him. She paid him generously, far more than he'd quoted, which she suspected wasn't the amount he'd originally intended to name. He didn't argue with the amount, which she respected. A man who understood his own value didn't need to perform gratitude for being paid fairly. He packed up the toolbox. The old 10mm wrench went back in the bottom, resting in the space it had apparently lived in for years, next to tools that had the same worn, worked quality. She walked him to his truck. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "You can ask." "Your father's tools. You still use them." He opened the truck's bed and set the toolbox down, turned to look at her. "Most of them, yeah." "Why?" "You could have new equipment." He thought about it for a second. The real answer, not the polite one. "He used them his whole life," Ethan said. "They have a feel to them. The tolerances are worn in. I know exactly how they behave." He paused. "Also, I think about him when I use them," which sounds... "No," Vanessa said. "It doesn't." They stood there for a moment. The morning had turned warm, the sun coming over the roof of the facility and landing on the lot in a way that made the faded silver of the truck glow briefly. "You have a daughter," she said. Danny had mentioned it. "Lily, she's 8. Something in his face changed when he said it. Not dramatically, just a small softening. "She's why I needed to leave by 3. She gets off the bus at 3:15. "Every day?" "Every day I can manage it," he said, "which is most days." Vanessa looked at him for a moment, thinking. "I might want to call you again," she said. "If that's all right." He met her eyes. "You know where to find me," he said. He got in the truck, backed out carefully, turned onto the main road. Vanessa stood in the lot for a moment after the truck disappeared, thinking about what she'd watched happen that morning. Not the repair itself, the repair was the smallest part of it. What she was thinking about was the way he'd stood next to the engine and listened, the patience of it, the absolute refusal to reach for the data before he'd heard the machine. Her father's voice, somewhere in the back of her memory. First you hear it, then you find it, then you fix it. She walked back into the facility. The drive back to Denton took an hour and 40 minutes because there was construction on the highway, and Ethan missed the exit he usually took and had to loop back through a stretch of secondary road that added 15 minutes and took him past a grain elevator and a Dollar General and a church with a marquee sign that said, "Showing up is half the battle," which he stared at for a moment at the red light before the light turned green and he moved on. He had the radio on low, not really listening to it, the kind of background noise that kept the inside of the cab from feeling too quiet. He'd been doing a lot of driving lately. Not for work. Cole's Automotive wasn't the kind of shop that did house calls, except apparently now it did, which was a thing he hadn't fully thought through when Danny Reyes had called him about the GT3 RS situation. It was more just that after he dropped Lily at school in the mornings, Sometimes he'd drive for 20 minutes before circling back to the shop, because the shop without another adult in it was a specific kind of quiet that he hadn't learned to wear comfortably yet. His father had died 14 months ago. A stroke, fast, a Tuesday in October when Ethan had been elbow deep in a transmission rebuild and his phone had buzzed twice on the workbench, and he'd ignored it because he was at a delicate point in the disassembly, and he'd looked at it 20 minutes later and seen 2 missed calls from Mercy General and had known before he even hit callback. Robert Cole had been 63 years old. He'd been in the shop 5 days a week for 41 of those years. He had smoked from age 17 to age 51, when Ethan's mother had told him with surgical precision that the cigarettes were leaving that house, or she was, and he'd quit cold turkey and replaced the habit with black coffee and an argumentative relationship with sports radio. He had enormous hands. He could hear a knock bearing it idle from across a parking lot. He'd been, by most conventional measures, a difficult man to be close to. Not cold exactly, but economy-minded with affection, the way certain men of that generation were. Like warmth was a resource with finite reserves. But he'd taught Ethan everything, and he'd loved Lily with a complete, uncomplicated openness that he'd never quite managed with adults. Every Thursday, he'd picked her up from school when she was in first grade and walked her to the shop, and she would sit on an overturned 5-gallon bucket next to his workbench, and he would explain what he was doing in language a 6-year-old could follow, and she'd watch with the focused, serious expression that she'd inherited from neither of her parents and that still appeared on her face sometimes when she was reading or working on a puzzle and made Ethan's chest do something that didn't have a name he knew. He pulled into the shop at 11:48, which meant he had 3 hours before he needed to leave to get to the school. Pasta. Cole's Automotive occupied a standalone building at the end of a short commercial strip that also contained a nail salon, a tax prep office that was only busy 4 months a year, and a shipping store. The building was beige stucco that had faded to something closer to the color of old newspaper. The sign above the bay doors said Cole's Automotive. Honest work, fair price. Price in block letters that Ethan had repainted 2 years ago and needed to repaint again. The concrete apron in front of the bays had an oil stain in the right front position that was old enough and large enough to be considered permanent. Inside, the shop had 2 bays. Bay 1 held a 2018 Chevy Silverado with a clattering valve train that belonged to a man named Gerald Boone, who drove it for work and needed it back by Monday. Bay 2 held nothing at the moment, which was unusual. Normally, Bay 2 had something in it. Ethan ran a full book most weeks, mostly through word of mouth and the sporadic Google review, occasionally through Danny Reyes's broad network of car people who trusted his recommendations. The empty bay was a problem he'd been thinking about in a background kind of way for 6 weeks, which was roughly how long it had been since the front left wall of his customer base had quietly walked away. His name was Don Parrish. He was a property developer who owned 7 rental units in the county and 2 personal vehicles, a 2020 Ram 2500 for actual work and a 2019 Mustang GT 500 that he drove on weekends when the weather allowed. He'd been bringing both vehicles to Cole's for 4 years, ever since Ethan had diagnosed an injector issue on the Ram that the dealer had misread twice. Don had referred 3 people to the shop personally. He paid quickly and without argument. In February, Don had brought the GT 500 in for a routine service, and Ethan had found a cracked lower control arm bushing during the inspection. He told Don about it, quoted the part and labor, and Don had said, "Yeah, go ahead." Ethan had ordered the part, and when it arrived it was wrong, a fitment issue with the aftermarket supplier, and getting the right part had taken 11 days instead of 3. Don had needed the car back for something the following weekend and had ended up picking it up before the bushing was replaced, with Ethan explaining the situation and offering a discount on the rescheduled work. Don had not rescheduled. He'd sent a text 3 weeks later saying he'd gone ahead and taken it somewhere else. No hard feelings. Thanks for everything. No hard feelings. Which probably meant some hard feelings. Ethan had stood in the empty bay for a while after reading that text. Not angry exactly, more like tired, because he knew the 11-day delay hadn't been his fault. Supplier error, supply chain issue, genuinely not something he'd done wrong. But he also knew that from Don's perspective, the car wasn't ready when it was supposed to be ready, and that was the only fact that mattered on Don's side of the transaction. He'd lost the account. He'd also lost 2 referrals that he'd been semi-expecting from Don's network, which he only knew about because Don had mentioned them offhandedly once, and then they'd never materialized, and you couldn't chase something like that. You just had to accept the shape of its absence. The shop was fine. The shop was not in danger. He was covering his costs, making payroll for himself and Sandra, his part-time office manager, who came in Tuesdays and Thursdays and kept his invoicing from becoming a disaster, and putting a small amount aside every month. But fine was not comfortable, and comfortable was not where he needed to be. And the thing about running a small shop was that the margin between fine and not fine was thin enough that losing 1 solid account felt like losing 10. He put the toolbox down in its corner of the shop, the corner it had occupied since his father's time, and stood next to the Silverado for a moment thinking about the morning. He hadn't expected the GT3 RS job to go like that. He'd expected to be shown around a very clean, very well-equipped facility, told in various professional ways about all the things that had already been checked, and then be handed a car that either had a problem he could find or didn't. He hadn't expected the particular quality of silence in that bay when the smoke machine produced its thin white wisp. He hadn't expected the way the head of service operations, Marcus, the organized, contained, clearly very capable man, had looked at that wisp with an expression that Ethan understood intimately because he'd worn it himself a handful of times. The expression of someone who has just seen something that should have been obvious, seen it for the first time, and has to process that it wasn't obvious to them. He hadn't said anything designed to make Marcus feel better about it, and hadn't said anything designed to make him feel worse. Both instincts had been present. He'd tried to just talk about the actual mechanics, the actual reason the standard diagnostic suite had missed it, because that was the truth, and the truth was the least confrontational thing he had available. The woman, though, Vanessa Sterling. He'd looked her up the night before, after Danny's call. You'd have had to be aggressively unplugged from the world to not know who she was in a broad sense. The tech money, the performance facility, the occasional profile piece in automotive publications when she had something new on the track. He'd read one of those pieces, skimmed it really, looking for something that would tell him what to expect. What he'd expected, and this was a bias he was willing to acknowledge, was a degree of performative expertise. The kind of person who had bought fluency in a subject, who knew the vocabulary and some of the substance, but navigated primarily through the confidence that money and position gave. The kind of person who would watch him work and interject with things they'd read in a magazine. She hadn't done that. She'd stood back and watched and let him work. And when she'd spoken, she'd said things that were direct and specific. And the thing she'd said near the end, about her father, the thing that wasn't the whole sentence, but was the shape of a thing she recognized, that had been real. He'd heard it in her voice. A person who'd been taught to pay attention to machines by someone they'd lost. He understood that particular education. He opened the hood of the Silverado and stood there for a moment, and then reached for a wrench and got back to work, because thinking about Vanessa Sterling was not going to fix Gerald Boone's valve train. Lily got off the bus at 3:18, 3 minutes late, because the bus driver had lingered at the second-to-last stop, while one of the older kids found a backpack he'd left on the seat. Ethan was standing at the curb in front of the school, hands in his jacket pockets, and he watched her come down the steps with her backpack. Purple, covered in iron-on patches that she'd been collecting for a year and a half, hanging off both shoulders, and her hair coming loose from the braid her teacher had apparently redone at some point during the day. She saw him, and her face did the thing it did, the thing that made the day worth it, and she crossed the sidewalk and walked straight into him, and he wrapped his arm around her, and she said, into his jacket, "You smell like the shop." "I was at a different shop today," he said. She pulled back and looked up at him with the specific narrow-eyed appraisal that she'd also inherited from someone. His father, he thought. Though she'd never met the woman his father had been before, parenthood softened some of his edges. "What kind of shop?" "Fancy one, very fancy. Car cost more than our house." Her eyes went wide, then suspicious. "More than our house?" $300 and some thousand. "That's insane," she said. In the completely unfiltered way 8-year-olds said things that adults had learned to dress up. "That's what I thought," he agreed. They walked to the truck. She climbed in the passenger side and buckled herself and dropped her backpack on the floor and pulled out a library book that she'd apparently been in the middle of and went straight back to it, because Lily treated transitions between places as opportunities to read rather than interruptions to it. He tried to figure out where this had come from. Neither he nor her mother had been readers particularly, and his father had only read the newspaper and automotive manuals. It seemed like something she'd arrived with, a trait that had been hers from the beginning, which was one of the things about kids that still caught him sideways occasionally. How much of who they were had nothing to do with you. He drove. She read. After a few minutes, she said, without looking up from the page, "Did you fix it, the fancy car?" "Yeah." "What was wrong with it?" "A loose clamp in the intake system, letting in a tiny amount of air that it wasn't supposed to." She considered this. Why didn't the computer find it? He glanced at her. "Why do you think?" She turned a page. "Because it was too small for the computer to notice?" "The computer noticed something was off," he said, "but it compensated. Adjusted the fuel mixture to try to account for the extra air. So the adjustment masked the problem. So the computer was fixing it, trying to fix it, not quite succeeding. And you found it by listening." "Basically, yeah." She turned another page. "Grandpa would have done the same thing." He drove for a moment without answering. "Yeah," he said. "He would have." She looked up from the book then, briefly, the way she sometimes did when she said something that had a heavier weight to it than she'd necessarily intended, checking to see what it had done to his face. He kept his face even, and she went back to reading, but he could feel the thing between them, the familiar shape of the absence they both carried, the one that had different dimensions for each of them, but that lived in the same general space of their shared life. She'd cried twice in the 6 months after Robert died. Both times in private. He'd found out the first time because he heard it through her bedroom door at night, and had stood in the hall for a moment not knowing what to do. He'd gone in, eventually, and sat on the edge of her bed, and she'd pulled herself together faster than he thought a 7-year-old should have had to. "I miss Grandpa," she'd said, straightforwardly, like she was reporting a fact. "Me too, Bug," he'd said. "Me too." He pulled into the driveway. She closed the book with her finger in the page to mark her place, because Lily did not use bookmarks on principle, which was a hill she had decided to die on at age 6 and from which she had not descended. Patti. That evening, after dinner, pasta and a salad that Lily ate around with the precision of a diplomat avoiding a difficult subject, and after Lily's bath and her 20 minutes of reading before lights out and the brief argument about whether 20 minutes was actually enough time to finish the chapter she was in the middle of, it was not. He let her have the chapter. Ethan sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee that had gone cold and his laptop open to his shop's accounting software. The numbers were not alarming. They were just quiet in a way that required attention. He had 18 active accounts, customers who brought vehicles to him on a regular basis, whose names he knew, whose cars he knew. He lost 1 or 2 a year to moving or to dealers or to whatever sequence of events caused a person to decide that the relationship had run its course. He gained 1 or 2 through referral. It had been a stable equilibrium for years. The problem was that stable equilibrium was not the same as growth, and he was 32 years old with a kid in 2nd grade and a mortgage that had 4 years left on the aggressive payment schedule he'd set up. When interest rates were different and a shop that needed a new lift in Bay 2 within the next 18 months, because the one currently in Bay 2 had begun to make a sound during descent that he'd diagnosed as a hydraulic cylinder issue, and that would not fix itself. He was not failing. He was not drowning. He was doing what he'd always done, working hard, doing good work, keeping the books balanced. But there was a version of his life that he thought about sometimes, usually late at night at this exact table, that was more than balanced. A version where he wasn't running the same 2-bay operation his father had run for the same 2-bay margins. A version where Lily could go to the better school district without him doing a specific kind of math every September. He closed the laptop. The red toolbox was in the corner of the kitchen. He'd brought it in from the truck, as he always did, because leaving it in the truck overnight felt wrong in a way he couldn't fully articulate. It had been in this kitchen, or the kitchen of the house before this one, since before he was old enough to understand what it was. His father had brought it home from work every night, not for any practical reason, just habit. A habit Ethan had inherited without meaning to. He looked at it for a moment. Then he rinsed out the coffee mug and went to bed. The call came on Tuesday. He was under the Silverado, Gerald Boone's truck, transmission pan off, looking at a filter that had more debris in it than he liked, when Sandra appeared at the bay door and said his phone had rung twice from the same number and she'd brought it in case it was something. He slid out from under the truck, looked at the screen. Vanessa Sterling, which was in his contacts now because after Saturday he'd added it. He called back. She picked up on the second ring. "Ethan, thank you for calling back." "Sure. Everything's still good with the car?" "The car is perfect. That's actually why I'm calling." A pause, the brief kind that indicated she was arranging something. "I want to be straight with you. I've been thinking about Saturday. Not just the repair, the whole morning. The way you approached it." He waited. "I'd like you to come back to the facility," she said. "Not for the car. I want you to look at the service division, the whole operation." He straightened up. "What do you mean, look at it?" "Walk through it. The workflow, the diagnostic approach, the procedures. Tell me what you see." She paused again. "I think there are things wrong with how we operate that look fine on paper and aren't fine in practice. The same way the GT3 RS looked fine in the data and wasn't fine in reality. I want someone who thinks like you think to walk through it." There was a silence while he processed that. "I'm a mechanic," he said. "I'm not a consultant. I don't have any background in operations management, or I'm not looking for operations management," she said. "I've had consultants. I have people with frameworks and presentations and recommendations that sit in binders." They on the faint edge in her voice when she said it was specific, the edge of someone who'd spent money on something that didn't deliver. "I want someone who can hear the engine." He almost said no. The reflex was there, the instinct that said this was outside the lane, that the offer had dimensions to it he couldn't see yet, that the right answer was to thank her and stay where he knew what he was doing. Instead, he said, "What day? What?" He came back the following Thursday. This time he was on time, 7 minutes early actually, because he'd left the shop to Sandra and given himself more room. He parked in the same spot, walked in through the same entrance, and found the facility operating in a way that Saturday, with the car's problem at the center of everything, hadn't given him a chance to really observe. There were 8 people working when he arrived. 2 technicians in the bays, one running a vehicle on the dyno through what looked like an emissions test cycle, one doing something with a wheel alignment rack, a service advisor at the front desk, a woman in her late 20s named Priya, who Ethan would later learn was in her second year with the company and had come from a dealer background, Marcus at a workstation in the elevated service office, visible through the glass panel, in conversation with someone on a phone, and 2 other people whose roles Ethan didn't immediately understand, but who moved through the space with the purposeful ambiguity of people who did important but non-obvious things. Vanessa met him at the entrance. She was dressed differently than Saturday. Business casual in a way that had clearly not involved much deliberation, dark pants and a gray shirt that had probably cost more than his Saturday outfit, but was wearing like it didn't know that. Her hair was down. She looked like someone who'd been at work for 3 hours already. "Thanks for coming," she said. "Thanks for having me." He meant it straightforwardly. The drive had been fine. She took him on a walkthrough first. No agenda stated. She just walked him through the operation and talked about it, describing what each station did, how the workflow moved from vehicle intake to service to delivery. She was precise. She knew her own operation in detail and described it without the puffery that people sometimes used when they were describing something they'd built. She described it the way you described something you wanted a second set of eyes on, which meant she included the parts she wasn't sure about. Ethan listened, asked questions occasionally. Not challenging questions, just the kind that opened things up. Why does the service advisor hand off to the tech at that point? What happens to the diagnostic data after a vehicle is delivered? How does the team communicate about work in progress? The answers were instructive, but less instructive than the moments between the answers. The hesitation when he asked about diagnostic data retention, which turned out to be because they stored it but had no system for learning from it, no process for identifying recurring patterns across vehicles. The way Priya, the service advisor, answered his question about customer communication with a slightly careful completeness that suggested she had opinions she'd decided not to volunteer. He spent 2 hours walking and talking and watching. Then Vanessa took him to the small conference room, the working one, not the formal one upstairs, and poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from him. "What do you see?" she said. He took a breath. He'd been organizing it during the walk. "You have a very capable technical team. The equipment is excellent. The individual skill level is high. But the system assumes that technology is primary." He was choosing words carefully, because what he was about to say was going to land on Marcus's work more than anyone else's, and he was aware of that. "Your diagnostic workflow is built around what the sensors tell you. The techs are trained to trust the data first, which is, look, that's not wrong. That's the right starting point for 95% of problems. And the other 5%, are the ones that don't tell you what they are until you've already established what they aren't. The data gives you the frame, but the mechanic has to step outside the frame to find certain things." He turned the coffee cup slightly on the table. "I think your team may have learned to stop at the frame." Vanessa was quiet, watching him. "There's also a communication gap," he continued. "The service advisor and the technicians aren't talking as much as they need to. Priya? She's fielding customer descriptions of problems, translating them into work orders, and those translations are losing information along the way. By the time the tech sees the complaint, it's been formalized into language that cuts out half the texture of what the customer actually experienced. Give me an example. A customer says their car hesitates on acceleration. Priya writes it up as hesitation on acceleration, customer requests diagnosis. Tech runs the diagnosis, finds nothing, writes it up as no fault found, car returned. But somewhere in that chain, the specific detail that the hesitation only happens when the AC is on gets lost. Because Priya didn't know to ask. Because the write-up format doesn't have space for it. Because the tech didn't call the customer to ask follow-up questions." He looked at her. "Your GT3RS had a version of that problem. The original complaint got professionalized into data, and then the data ran the investigation, and the data had nothing to say." Vanessa sat back slightly, not defensively. She was doing something more like absorbing. "What would you change?" "The intake process, how you take the complaint. Someone, not necessarily a tech, just someone who knows machines and knows how to listen, should spend 5 minutes with every customer before the car gets written up. Ask the questions that aren't on the form. Get the texture of the problem, not just the category. That's a staffing change. It's a mindset change that has staffing implications," he said. "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment. Her coffee had not been touched. Outside, through the glass wall of the conference room, they could see the shop floor, the technicians working with the particular focused economy of people who were good at what they did. She watched it for a second. "What else?" she said. He'd expected her to push back more, to defend what she'd built, which was substantial and good, and deserved defending. The readiness to hear more said something about her that he filed away. "Your documentation of historical repairs is stored but not analyzed," he said. "You're sitting on 4 years of vehicle data and you're not using it to build pattern recognition. Same complaint types, same vehicle models, same failure modes reappearing. If you had someone reviewing that regularly, you'd start to see the fingerprints of problems before they fully manifest. Like catching the loose clamp before it becomes a 6-week investigation. In theory, yeah. You'd at least have a checklist, things to look at specifically on high-mileage GT3s that the factory diagnostic doesn't flag." She turned her coffee cup, set it down. "You've been here 2 hours." "Yeah." "You just described 2 systemic problems that I've had consultants in here for 3 months who didn't identify." He was uncomfortable with where that was going, but he didn't let it show. "I had a specific lens. The GT3 situation primed me to see a certain kind of thing." "Don't do that," she said. "Don't do what?" "The modest deflection. I've seen it twice now. Someone says you did something significant and you explain why it wasn't as significant as they're making it." She looked at him steadily. "It's not working on me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he almost smiled, which was a thing he didn't do easily and which appeared on his face with a slightly surprised quality, like it had arrived before he'd decided to let it. "Fair enough. he said. I want to make you an offer, Vanessa said. The room was quiet in a specific way, the quiet of something being said that had been building toward being said. I want you to take a leadership role here, head of diagnostic quality, for lack of a better title. We can work out the actual language. Your job would be to do exactly what you did this morning. Walk the operation, identify the gap between what the data says and what the machine is actually doing. Build the processes that catch what the systems miss. She paused. It would be a significant step up from what you're doing now. The compensation would reflect that. He sat with it for a moment. I have a shop, he said. I know. My father built that shop. It's been Cole's Automotive for 41 years. I know that too. She didn't move, didn't push. I'm not asking you to close it today. I'm asking you to think about what you want the next 10 years to look like. That landed somewhere specific. The kitchen table, the cold coffee, the accounting software with the numbers that were fine and not enough, the new lift that Bay 2 needed, the school district math every September. There's one thing, he said. Tell me. I leave at 2:45 every day, every workday. Doesn't matter what's happening. He met her eyes. My daughter gets off the bus at 3:15. I'm there when she gets off the bus. Vanessa didn't hesitate. Not even a second. That's not a condition I need to consider, she said. That's a fact I'm accepting right now. He looked at her for a moment, testing the weight of it, the way you tested the seating of a clamp before you were done, not because you expected it to fail, but because certainty was something you established rather than assumed. I'll think about it, he said. That's all I'm asking. He stood up. She walked him out, the same as Saturday. The lot was warm, the same afternoon light coming over the building. His truck was in the same spot. Ethan, she said as he opened the door. He turned. You said your father taught you to listen before you reach for the data. She was standing with her arms loosely crossed, squinting slightly against the light. Did he teach you anything else worth keeping? He thought about it. Robert Cole's hands on a wrench, the patient way he'd explain things to a kid who hadn't yet learned to slow down enough to hear. The economy of his affection, and the completeness of it, anyway. He said that the machine always tells you the truth, Ethan said. You just have to be willing to hear something you didn't expect. Vanessa looked at him for a moment. Something moved through her expression, not quite recognition, not quite something else. Something between. Get home safe, she said. He got in the truck. The drive back was quieter than the one last Saturday. He didn't try to analyze that. He just drove, the radio low, the early afternoon light laying flat across the highway, and thought about nothing in particular and everything at once, the way a person did when something was shifting under them, and they hadn't decided yet how to feel about standing on moving ground. Lily was going to ask about the fancy shop again tonight. He was going to have to figure out what to tell her. He wasn't sure yet what he was going to say. He thought about it for 4 days. That was longer than it felt from the inside, where each day had its own texture and its own reasons to not sit down and make a decision. Monday was the Silverado, which needed a second look after Gerald Boone drove it briefly and reported a new noise that turned out to be a heat shield rattle unrelated to the valve train work. Nothing serious, 20 minutes to fix, but it ate the morning's momentum. Tuesday was a walk-in, a woman in her early 40s named Connie Marsh, who drove an '09 Camry with 190,000 miles on it and a brake pedal that had gone soft on her on the highway, which was exactly the kind of thing that required immediate attention, and got it. Wednesday. Sandra came in, and they went through the invoicing backlog, and Ethan signed checks and stared at the numbers that were fine, but not enough with the same flat expression he'd been wearing at that kitchen table for months. Thursday morning, he dropped Lily at school and drove to the shop and sat in the truck in the parking lot for 12 minutes before going inside. The offer was real. He'd looked Vanessa Sterling up more carefully this time. Not the profile pieces, but the actual business record. The facility had been operating for 6 years and had grown steadily in that time, from a 2-person operation to 14 full-time staff. She'd built the client base deliberately, targeting a specific tier of high-performance vehicle owners who wanted expertise that dealers couldn't provide. The facility had a reputation that was solid and specific. This was not a vanity project. This was a real business run by a person who understood real businesses. The compensation she'd described, even without a specific number yet, was in a range that would change the math. Not eliminate it. The mortgage was the mortgage. The school district was the school district. But change it. Give it room he didn't currently have. And the work itself. That was the part he kept coming back to in the odd moments between tasks. The thing that he turned over in his hands the way you turned over a component you were trying to understand. Walking the operation. Identifying the gap between data and reality. Building systems that caught what other systems missed. It was a different scale of what he already did. A larger version of the same problem, the same attention, the same willingness to stand next to something and listen. His father's voice, somewhere in the middle of everything. A man who only does what he already knows how to do will find the world shrinking around him without ever understanding why. Robert Cole had said that once, or something like it. Ethan couldn't be sure of the exact words anymore, which bothered him in the imprecise way that grief bothered you. Not acutely, not always, but in the small moments when you reached for something and found it slightly out of focus. He got out of the truck and went inside and called Vanessa Sterling. She picked up on the third ring. Ethan? I want to hear the specific terms before I decide anything, he said. The title, the compensation, what the role actually looks like day to day. I'm not saying yes, but I'm not saying no yet, and I need the actual picture before I can say either. A pause. Brief, and he had the sense it was the pause of someone who'd expected a different opening and was adjusting to this one. That's reasonable. Can you come in Friday? I can come in Friday. I'll have Marcus there too, she said. That gave him a moment. Why Marcus? Because if this works the way I think it will, you two will have to function together. I'd rather have that conversation with all three of us in the room than hand you a job description and discover 6 weeks in that the working relationship is a problem. He hadn't thought of it that way, but she was right. Marcus Webb was a precise, organized, capable professional who had spent 3 years building a service operation that he was proud of, and who had watched an unknown mechanic from a strip mall shop in Denton walk in and find, in 40 minutes, the thing that 6 weeks and multiple certified specialists had missed. That was not a neutral experience. It left a mark. And a mark that wasn't acknowledged had a way of becoming something harder over time. That makes sense, he said. Friday at 10, she said. I'll have everything laid out. He said he'd be there. She hung up. He stood for a moment with his phone in his hand and then put it in his pocket and went to look at Connie Marsh's Camry because the Brakemaster cylinder he'd ordered had arrived and the work wasn't going to do itself. He told Lily that night. Not the full version, not the specific compensation or the operational details or the question of what happened to the shop, just the fact of it. He waited until after dinner, which was chicken with rice, the easy version, the one he could make without actively thinking about it. And after she'd done her 20 minutes of reading and he'd done the chapter negotiation and she'd agreed, unusually without argument, that 20 minutes was probably enough tonight because she was tired. She was in the kitchen getting a glass of water before bed. He was at the table with his coffee. He said, "Can I tell you something?" She turned from the sink holding the glass. She was wearing pajamas with cartoon foxes on them. Her hair was still slightly damp from the bath. Yeah? The woman with the fancy car. Vanessa Sterling. She offered me a job. Lily set the glass on the counter and looked at him with the full attention expression. At the fancy shop? Yeah. What kind of job? Running the diagnostic side of things. Finding the problems their systems miss. He paused. Like what I did with the GT3RS. She chewed on that. She was quiet for a moment in the way that was not absence but processing. What about our shop? Our shop. He heard it. That's the part I'm still figuring out. Would you still be a mechanic? A different kind, maybe. More building the systems, teaching the approach. She picked up her glass again, drank some water, set it down. Is it more money? He looked at her. She was 8 years old, and she knew the shape of the question, had learned to ask it the way you learned the questions that mattered in the house you grew up in. His chest did the thing. Yeah, he said. It would be more money. She nodded once, slowly, with a gravity that was entirely too adult for a fox pajamas situation. "You should probably do it then," she said. "It's more complicated than just the money bug." "I know," she said. She came over and kissed him on the cheek, the way she'd been doing since she was 4, just matter-of-factly, as a form of punctuation. "But it's not less complicated without it." She went to bed. He sat at the table for a long time after. Bob. Friday's meeting was not what he'd expected, which he should have anticipated by now, was a pattern with Vanessa Sterling. He'd expected a formal presentation, a conference room version of an offer letter, a document, maybe a PowerPoint, a series of talking points delivered in the professional voice that people adopted when they wanted to seem both approachable and certain. That was what you got in rooms like the facility's conference room when someone was making you an offer. Instead, Vanessa had arranged 3 chairs around the end of the long table, not the formal sitting across from each other configuration, but something closer to a triangle, the configuration of people who were actually trying to talk rather than perform. Marcus was already there when Ethan arrived, sitting with a legal pad and a pen he'd clearly been turning in his hand. He nodded when Ethan came in, not warm, but present. A man who had decided to be in this room. Vanessa had a folder, but didn't open it. "I want to start with something before we get into the specifics," she said. "Marcus, I asked you to be here because I think what I'm proposing changes your role, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. You deserve to hear it directly and have a say in whether the structure makes sense." Marcus's jaw moved. He was listening. "What I want to build is a diagnostic quality layer that sits alongside the service operation, not above it. Alongside it." She looked between them. "Marcus runs service operations. That doesn't change. His authority over workflow, staffing, process management, that's his domain. What I want Ethan to run is the piece that the service operation, by its own admission, doesn't currently cover. The detection of problems the data misses. The front-end intake process. The historical pattern analysis," she paused. "They're complementary. But they have to be built as complementary, or they'll become competitive. I want that conversation to happen now, in this room, rather than later when it's a personnel problem." There was a silence. Marcus turned his pen in his hand once more, then set it down. "What does that look like in practice?" he said. His voice was even, professional. "If a tech is running a diagnosis and reaches a dead end, does that get escalated to Ethan? Who has the call?" "The tech escalates. Ethan consults." She looked at Ethan. "You're not overriding Marcus's team. You're available to his team." Ethan said, "And if I find something systematic, a process issue, a gap in how diagnoses are being run, you bring it to Marcus first," Vanessa said. "Not to me, not as a complaint, as a professional observation between colleagues." She said the last part looking at both of them. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He was doing the math the same way Ethan had seen him do it in the Bay, careful, sequential, working through the implications. "I want to say something," Marcus said finally. "Please," Vanessa said. He looked at Ethan. His expression was the expression of a man who was choosing precision over comfort. "I've been running this operation for 3 years. I have good systems. My team is well trained. The GT3 situation was a failure of process, not a failure of competence, and I know the difference." He paused. "What I don't want is to be managing around a consultant who thinks they found one thing and now believes they understand everything." It was direct. It was fair. Ethan said, "I don't think I understand everything. I found a loose clamp that 6 weeks of competent, thorough work didn't catch. That tells me something about a specific kind of blind spot, not about the overall quality of what you've built." He met Marcus's eyes. "What you've built is good. I saw it Thursday. The team is genuinely good. I'm not here to tear it down. I'm here to add the piece it doesn't have." A beat. "And if we disagree," Marcus said, "about a diagnosis or a process or a call, we argue about it like professionals, and whoever's right is right," Ethan said. "I don't have an ego about being wrong. Ask Marcus about the smoke test." Marcus almost did something with his face. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the nearest thing to one that the situation allowed. "He gave me the technical explanation for why we missed it," he said to Vanessa. "Nobody else had the decency." Vanessa looked at them both. "So we can work with this." Marcus picked up his pen again. "Tell me the numbers," he said. The number Vanessa named was $60,000 above what Ethan made in a good year at the shop. Not twice his income, not quite, but close enough that the room felt slightly different after she said it. She said it plainly, without performance, the way you said something when you wanted it to be heard clearly rather than reacted to. She also said health insurance, which was something Ethan had been managing through a marketplace plan for 2 years since his father's shop coverage had ended, and which cost him more than it should have and covered less than he needed. She also said, "I want to fund the professional development side of this. Conferences, certifications, anything that builds the capability you're bringing in. That's not optional. I want the investment documented and tracked because I want to see it compound." He hadn't expected that part. It was the kind of statement that told you something about how a person thought about the people who worked for them. Not as costs to be managed, but as things worth developing. He filed it. He said, "I need to figure out the shop." "How long do you need?" He thought about it. 30 days? That works. I'd want you starting on a 30-day timeline regardless. I need to rebuild the intake process before we can build anything else, and that takes time to design. She paused. "What are your options with the shop? You've said it's been Kohl's for 41 years. It has. I have 2 choices that I can see. One is I find someone to run it, a working manager, someone who can take the customer relationships and keep the volume going. The other is I close it." He'd said the second option before he'd decided whether he was actually considering it, which meant somewhere in the 4 days of thinking he had been considering it, which was its own kind of information. "Closing it isn't something I'm ready to say out loud yet," he added. "You don't have to," Vanessa said. Marcus said, "What kind of volume are you running? Monthly?" It was a different kind of question from Marcus. Not operational challenge, just genuine curiosity, the tone of one professional asking another. 12 to 16 vehicles a month, Ethan said. 2 bays, working mostly solo with some part-time office help. Marcus nodded slowly. "You could find a working manager. The right person with the client relationships maintained. That operation runs itself. In theory. Do you have someone in mind?" Ethan had been thinking about this. There was a man named Carl Brewer who had worked for his father for 7 years, left to run the service department at a mid-sized dealer, and called Ethan 6 months ago to mention that the dealer environment had gotten to him and he was looking at options. Carl was 51, thorough, and genuinely good with customers in the unhurried, old-school way that kept people coming back. Ethan had told him he'd keep it in mind and then done nothing with it because at the time there was nothing to do with it. "Maybe," Ethan said. "Start there," Marcus said. It was the most collegial thing he'd said in the meeting, and it landed that way. He called Carl Brewer that afternoon from the parking lot of a gas station on the way back to Denton because the drive was 90 minutes and he didn't want to wait until he got home and talked himself into a more complicated version of the conversation. Carl picked up on the 4th ring, slightly out of breath, the way a man answered the phone when he'd been in the middle of something physical. "Ethan Cole," Carl said. "That's a surprise. You still looking at options?" A pause. "Depends on the option. I might need someone to run Kohl's. Not own it. I'm not selling. Run it. Full operational authority, profit-sharing arrangement, the customer relationships intact." He paused. "You'd be working with my father's accounts, his name's still on the building." There was a long silence. Carl had known Robert Cole for 20 years, had learned things from him. The weight of the name on the building was not lost on either of them. "What happened to you?" Carl said. "Got an offer I needed to think seriously about." "Where?" "Sterling Performance Facility, over in—" "I know who that is," Carl said. "Vanessa Sterling." "Yeah." Another silence. "That's—" Carl stopped, started again. "That's a significant thing, Ethan." "I know. Your father would have—" He stopped himself again. Ethan waited. "He would have had an opinion about it, is what I was going to say. He always had an opinion about everything." "True enough." Carl exhaled. Ethan could hear him moving, stepping outside somewhere, probably, getting clear of background noise. Tell me about the running arrangement, specifically. They talked for 40 minutes. By the time Ethan pulled back into the shop lot, the shape of something was visible, not finalized, not signed, but outlined. Carl would come in to look at the books, walk the bays, talk to Sandra. Nothing committed. But Carl was interested in the way that people were interested when something arrived at the right moment and fit the right space. Ethan sat in the truck for a moment after hanging up. He thought about his father's hands on the steering wheel. Robert had driven this truck for 6 years before Ethan bought it from him. The seat had the shape of his father's hours in it, in the way that old vehicles held the physical record of the people who'd lived in them. He got out and went to finish the day's work. The 30 days moved the way significant months move, faster than you want them to and slower in the individual days. Carl Brewer came in on the third Saturday and spent 4 hours with Ethan going through the books, the accounts, the relationship history with each customer. He asked good questions. He didn't try to negotiate anything he hadn't earned the right to negotiate. He left saying he needed a week to think and called back in 5 days with a yes. Sandra, when Ethan told her the plan, was quiet for a moment and then said, "Okay, but I'm staying." She said it like a declaration rather than a question. He hadn't actually asked her yet. He'd been planning to. "You'd be working for Carl," he said. "I know, Carl's fine. I knew Carl when your dad was running this place." She paused. "Are you okay?" He thought about it. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." "Your dad would be—" She stopped. Everybody keeps stopping in the middle of that sentence, Ethan said. "Because nobody wants to get it wrong," Sandra said. "What he would have thought is a thing that matters, and none of us want to put the wrong words in his mouth." He looked at her. Sandra had been in the shop for 9 years. She'd been there when his mother had died, which was 8 years before Robert. She'd been there when Lily was born. She made terrible coffee and kept the invoicing in a state of order that Ethan could not have replicated with twice the effort. "I think he'd have had something specific to say about taking a job from a woman 30 years younger than him," Ethan said. "And I think he'd have come around to it by Tuesday." Sandra laughed. It was a real laugh, short and sharp, and it meant something in the space of the moment. "That's about right," she said. 3 weeks into the 30 days, something happened that he hadn't budgeted for. He'd been at the facility 2 more times, once to walk through the intake redesign with Vanessa and a woman named Dana Cho who handled operational documentation, once for a longer session with Marcus where they'd mapped out the escalation protocol for diagnostic dead ends. Both sessions had gone productively, which was to say they had gone with the friction of real work rather than the smoothness of performance. Marcus was warming. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but in the incremental way that precise professional people warmed, through the accumulation of small, consistent evidence. Ethan had been right about the diagnostic gap, and he hadn't been an asshole about it, and he'd been wrong about a detail in the documentation analysis and acknowledged it without fuss. Those things built something, slowly, in the particular economy of Marcus Webb's esteem. The thing that happened was unrelated to any of that. He picked up Lily from school on a Wednesday, a normal Wednesday, nothing notable in the schedule, and she got in the truck and buckled herself and didn't immediately pull out a book, which was unusual enough that he noticed it before she'd said anything. "What's going on, Mike?" he said. She looked out the window for a moment, then, "My teacher asked us what our parents do for work." "Okay." "I said you were a mechanic." "That's accurate." "And then Madison Kowalski said her dad worked in finance and made a lot of money, and then she looked at me." She said it flatly, reporting a fact. Lily did not overdramatize things. If anything, she underdramatized them, which sometimes made them worse. He was quiet for a moment. He knew Madison Kowalski only as a name Lily mentioned occasionally, and not always warmly. "And what did you say?" "I said my dad fixed the car of one of the richest people in the state, and she couldn't find anyone else who could do it." She paused. "Then I said money is not the same as knowing what you're doing." He looked at the road. "Did you really say that?" "Yeah." "Where did that come from?" She shrugged, which was Lily's way of saying something came from somewhere she didn't feel like explaining. "Is it true?" About money not being the same as knowing what you're doing? Yeah. Yeah, he said. It's true. Though money and knowing what you're doing can exist together. Like with Vanessa Sterling. He glanced at her. She was looking at him with the clear, uncomplicated gaze that she sometimes deployed like a tool. Like with Vanessa Sterling, he agreed. She's very good at some things. She has a lot of money. Both things are true. Is she nice? He thought about it with the seriousness the question deserved. She's direct, he said, which isn't the same as nice, but is usually more useful. Lily appeared to find this satisfactory. She pulled out her book. Ethan, she said, without looking up, because she'd started calling him by his name occasionally in the past year, which he found both disarming and correct coming from her. Yeah? I'm glad you're taking the job. He drove. The afternoon light was coming in low through the windshield, the kind of late-day light that made ordinary roads look briefly significant. Me too, Bug, he said. The last day at the shop was a Thursday. He'd arranged it that way deliberately. Carl would take over on Friday, Sandra would be there, and Ethan would come by on Saturday morning, not as the owner, but as someone stopping in. He stayed late on Thursday. Not because there was work, there wasn't much left. The bays were both clear for the handoff. But because he wasn't ready to leave until he was ready to leave, and he wanted to know the difference between those two things from the inside. He walked the bays. Both of them, slowly, with the lights on, and the shop quiet in the way it got after 6 when the day's work was finished and the machines were cooling. Bay 1 smelled like the castrol oil he'd been using for years, and like the specific warmth of worked metal. Bay 2 smelled the same, plus the faint hydraulic note of the lift. He stood at the workbench along the back wall. His father's workbench, so the actual one, not a replacement, though Ethan had replaced the wooden surface twice. The metal legs were original, spray-painted gray decades ago, and repainted once more. And in the corner where the two legs met the cross brace, there were 3 initials scratched lightly into the metal with something sharp. RCE, which stood for Robert Cole, and were followed by a date that was 40 years ago, the year his father had built the bench. Ethan had always known the initials were there. He'd never thought about them particularly. He thought about them now. He picked up the red toolbox from its corner, carried it to the truck, set it in the bed. Then he went back inside, turned off the lights bay by bay, and stood at the door for one more moment. The shop in the dark was not sad exactly. It was the kind of place that held the record of things clearly without editorializing. Work had happened here. A man had built something here, and then his son had continued it, and now the continuation was changing shape. The walls didn't have a feeling about that. The workbench didn't either. They just held the record. He locked up. He sat in the truck and didn't start it for a few minutes. A car went past on the street outside, its headlights sweeping briefly across the sign, Cole's Automotive, honest work, fair price. Still needed repainting. Carl would probably get to it. He started the truck. He drove home. Lily was asleep when he got in. He checked, the way he always did. Looked in through the half-open door at her in the specific child sprawl that she achieved in sleep. One arm flung out toward the nightstand, her book face down next to her because she'd almost certainly been reading past bedtime and fallen asleep mid-chapter. He pulled the book gently from under her hand and put it on the nightstand, face up so she wouldn't lose the page. Pulled the blanket up slightly. Stood in the doorway for a moment. In 6 days, he would walk into Sterling Performance Facility as someone who worked there. He would have a desk. Vanessa had mentioned a desk, which he'd found briefly alarming as a concept, and a role with a title that was still being finalized, and a set of problems that were larger and more complex than any he'd managed before. He didn't feel ready, exactly. But then, his father had once told him that feeling ready was usually just feeling comfortable, and that those were not the same thing, and that comfortable was where people stopped. He turned off Lily's light, walked down the hall, stood in the kitchen for a moment, the red toolbox in its corner, the coffee maker with its clock blinking 11:47. Then he went to bed because tomorrow was going to be a long day, and the day after that would be longer. And the one after that was the one that started something new. His first real day at Sterling Performance Facility was a Monday, which felt right in the way that beginnings should feel. Not auspicious, not charged with meaning, just a day that was the first of something rather than the continuation of something else. He arrived at 7:53, which was earlier than he needed to be and later than he'd wanted, because he'd stood in the kitchen for 11 minutes drinking coffee and not quite leaving. And then the drive had taken longer than his test run the week before because there was a slow truck on the secondary road that he couldn't pass for 6 miles. He pulled into the lot and sat for a moment and looked at the facility's clean exterior and the early light coming off the roof and thought, with a clarity that was neither excitement nor dread, but something more like the feeling before you take the first swing at something you've committed to swing at. This is it. He had a desk. Vanessa had shown it to him during the second Thursday visit. A workstation in a glass-walled room adjacent to the main service floor, which had previously been used for storage and had been cleared out and outfitted in the 3 weeks since the offer. The desk itself was a plain, dark wood surface with a monitor, a keyboard, and a rolling chair that was more ergonomic than anything he'd ever owned. There was a shelf unit on the back wall where someone had placed a wire inbox and a cup of pens, which looked like it had been arranged by someone trying to make a space look occupied and functional rather than staged. He sat in the chair and looked at the monitor and thought about his father's workbench. They were not comparable objects. The workbench had 40 years of use ground into its surface. This desk still had the slight chemical smell of new furniture, but they were both the place where the work happened, and that was a form of kinship. He powered on the monitor. The first email in his inbox was from Vanessa, sent at 6:48 that morning, which told him something about when she started her day. It said, "Welcome to the first day. No agenda this morning. Use the time to get oriented. I have a client meeting until 11. Come find me after. Versus." The second email was from Marcus. Subject line, diagnostic backlog. 3 items. Body. These are 3 vehicles currently in the shop with unresolved diagnostic complaints. 2 have been through a full cycle without fault confirmation. 1 is new intake today. I'd like your read on all 3 when you're ready. No rush. Then the 3 vehicle summaries, brief and organized, because Marcus Webb did not write unnecessary words. No rush from Marcus meant within the morning. Ethan understood this immediately. It was not a test, not exactly, more like an extension of the conversation they'd started in that conference room. The one where Marcus had said, "I don't want to be managing around a consultant who thinks they found one thing and now believes they understand everything." And Ethan had said, "Whoever's right is right." The backlog was Marcus extending the working relationship into actual work. Ethan would have done the same thing. He printed the summaries. The printer behind him worked on the second try, not the first, which was its own kind of welcome, and walked out onto the service floor. Awesome. The first 2 vehicles were a 2021 Audi RS6 and a 2019 McLaren 5.7 OOS. Both had been through the facility's full diagnostic protocol. Both had complaints that the data hadn't confirmed. The RS6's owner had reported a vibration at highway speed that appeared only above 90 miles per hour and disappeared below 85. The McLaren's owner had described an occasional hesitation on cold starts that resolved within 30 seconds and had never been witnessed by a technician because by the time the car was brought in and connected, the engine was always warm. Ethan read both summaries the way he read most things, quickly first, then slowly, looking for the detail that sat between the lines. Both were competently written. Both documented what had been checked with precision, and both, he thought, had the same structural absence. They documented the negative space of the problem without spending much time on the description the customer had actually given. The RS6 summary said, "Customer reports vibration at highway speed." That was it. No detail about where the vibration was felt. Steering wheel, seat, pedals. No detail about whether it varied with throttle or was constant at speed. No detail about whether it had appeared suddenly or gradually. The McLaren summary said, "Customer reports cold start hesitation, resolves within 30 seconds. Same issue. No description of what kind of hesitation, a stumble, a rough idle, a momentary stall. No question about ambient temperature when it occurred. No question about how long the car typically sat between starts. These weren't criticisms of the technicians. They were criticisms of the intake process that had filtered the complaints before the technicians received them. Ethan was looking at the downstream consequence of exactly what he'd described to Vanessa 3 weeks ago. Information lost in translation, problems professionalized into categories before anyone had heard the full story. He found Tyler, the technician from the GT 3-day, the young one with the automotive technology degree who'd had the smoke machine, and Bay 3 doing a fluid service on a Ferrari 488. "Tyler," Ethan said. Tyler looked up. "Hey, good morning. Welcome, I guess." "Thanks." "The RS6. Whose is it?" "Mine right now. It's been in twice." "Tell me about it. Not the report. Just tell me what you know." Tyler set down the funnel he'd been using. He was 24, Ethan would learn, and he had the quality of attention that good young mechanics either arrived with or developed fast. The ability to shift between the task at hand and the conversation requiring full presence. The owner's a woman, mid-50s. She drives it on a highway commute, about 40 miles each way. She says the vibration is in the seat. Not the wheel, not the pedals, specifically in the seat. And it gets worse if she accelerates through the speed range rather than just cruising at speed. None of that was in the written summary. "How did you find that out?" Ethan said. "I called her," Tyler said. "When the second diagnostic came back clean, I called and asked more questions. I didn't put it in the report because I wasn't sure it was relevant yet." "It's relevant," Ethan said. Vibration felt in the seat rather than the steering wheel isolates it to the rear drivetrain or suspension. Worse under acceleration means it's likely load-dependent, prop shaft, differential, possibly a worn CV joint on the rear axle. The data doesn't flag it because there's no sensor on a CV joint. Tyler blinked. "So it's not a diagnosis problem. It's a history-taking problem," Ethan said. "The answer was in the customer's description. We just didn't have the full description." Tyler nodded slowly. He had the expression of someone who was filing something away carefully. "I can pull the rear axle today if Marcus approves it." "I'll talk to Marcus," Ethan said. He found Marcus in the service office. The door was open, which Ethan was beginning to understand was Marcus's signal for available, as opposed to the closed door, which meant not right now. He knocked on the frame anyway. Marcus looked up from his monitor. "How's the morning?" "Productive, I think." Ethan sat in the chair across from the desk without being invited, because they were past that. The RS6. Tyler got additional history on it by calling the customer directly. Vibration is seat felt, worse under acceleration. That profile points to rear drivetrain, not the systems you've been testing. Marcus was quiet for a moment. The intake write-up didn't include that. The intake write-up had half the information. He kept his voice even. Not a tech failure. Priya didn't know what questions to ask because the intake form doesn't prompt for them. Marcus picked up his pen, set it down. "What do you need for the RS6? "Pull the rear axle. Look at the CV joints on both sides and check the prop shaft balance." He paused. "And I'd like to sit down with Priya this week and work through the intake form. Not to make her job harder, to give her a better tool." "She'll cooperate," Marcus said. "She's been frustrated with the form herself. She just didn't have the—" He stopped. "Didn't have the mandate," Ethan finished. "Yes." Marcus looked at him for a moment. "What about the McLaren?" "Cold start hesitation that resolves in 30 seconds. I want to talk to the owner directly before I make a call on it. We don't have enough history." "He's particular," Marcus said, which was a careful word for something more specific. "Particular how?" "His name is Garrison Wolf. He's been a client for 2 years. He is, Marcus chose words, knowledgeable. He researches extensively before any work is approved. He will ask you questions." "That's fine." "He's also questioned several of my team's diagnoses in the past, not always incorrectly." A pause. "He's the kind of client who is useful to retain and difficult to manage." Ethan understood this as a form of preparation rather than a warning. Marcus was handing him context that would have taken weeks to acquire otherwise. That was a collegial act, and they both knew it. "Thanks for the heads up," Ethan said. Marcus nodded once, looked back at his monitor. Then, without looking up, "The McLaren's owner is coming in Thursday. I'll let him know you'll be the point of contact." "Works for me." He walked back out onto the service floor, and something about the walk itself, the texture of it, the sense of a day that was happening rather than being managed, felt like the right shape of a thing. Not comfortable yet, but right. The first 3 weeks accumulated the way the beginning of real work accumulated, in a density of small things rather than a sequence of events. Ethan had expected, in some abstract way, that the move from Coles to Sterling would feel like an expansion. What it actually felt like, most days, was like being a different kind of mechanic, one who diagnosed the system rather than the individual machine. He rebuilt the intake questionnaire with Priya over 2 afternoons in the conference room. Priya was sharp and specific, had a good memory for the details customers gave her verbally that she hadn't known to formalize, and had opinions about the process that she'd been sitting on for a year and a half. Given the invitation, she talked for 40 minutes without stopping, and most of what she said was useful. Ethan typed while she talked, pulling out the structural questions that needed to become standard. The new form was longer than the old one by 8 questions. 3 of them were about where symptoms were felt, which part of the car, which conditions, which inputs triggered them. 2 were about the history of the symptom, gradual or sudden onset, any preceding events, any pattern in occurrence. 1 was about temperature, ambient conditions when the symptom appeared. 2 were open-ended. Is there anything else about the symptom that you'd want a mechanic to know? And have you noticed anything else about the car's behavior recently, even if it seems unrelated? That last question caught more things than either of them expected. It turned out that several customers, asked whether they'd noticed anything else unrelated, mentioned things that weren't unrelated at all. A slight change in fuel economy 3 weeks before a fuel system problem became apparent, an intermittent dashboard warning that had disappeared before the car came in, a noise that had resolved itself, pattern edges that weren't the chief complaint, but were the context around it. Priya started using the new form on the second Wednesday. By Friday, she'd flagged 2 additional details on new intake vehicles that turned out to be directly relevant to the diagnostic path. She reported this to Ethan with a barely contained satisfaction that she was too professional to make entirely visible, and he told her directly that she was good at this, and that the improvement in information quality was already showing because she deserved to hear it said plainly. She went back to her desk looking like someone whose instrument had been tuned. The RS6 was resolved within a week. Tyler found a worn outer CV joint on the driver's rear axle. Not failed, not flagged by any sensor, but worn enough that under load at sustained high speed, it was generating the low-frequency vibration that traveled through the suspension into the seat. Replacement, road test, confirmed resolution. The owner called on the day she got the car back and asked to speak with whoever had figured it out. Marcus transferred the call to Ethan. She said, "I took that car to 2 shops and a dealer. Nobody looked at the CV joints." "Nobody had the full picture of where the vibration was," Ethan said. "Once we had that, it pointed to the rear drivetrain." "Why didn't they ask?" He didn't have a complete answer for that. "Diagnostic intake is a skill that doesn't always get the attention it deserves," he said. "We've been working on improving ours." She said she'd be recommending the facility to several of her friends. Marcus, who had been standing within earshot, heard this and looked at Ethan with an expression that was not quite a smile and was better than one. Garrison Wolf arrived on Thursday as scheduled, which was to say, he arrived 12 minutes early and was standing in the facility entrance looking at the service floor with the alert, evaluative gaze of someone who was assessing rather than admiring. He was 56, compact, wearing a sport coat over a collared shirt, in a combination that wasn't quite formal and wasn't quite casual. He had the posture of a man who'd been athletic in his 40s and maintained most of it. Ethan met him at the front. "Mr. Wolf, Ethan Cole." Wolf looked at him with the specific appraisal that Ethan had been told to expect. "You're the one Marcus said would be handling this?" "That's right. I've dealt with 4 different people in this facility over the past 2 years. Every time I come in, I seem to get someone new." It was delivered as an observation rather than a complaint, but the distinction was thin. "I understand that's been frustrating," Ethan said. "I'm the permanent contact for diagnostic cases. That won't change." Wolf looked at him for a second longer than the statement required, measuring something. "You're new here." To this facility, yes, not to diagnostics. The GT3RS, Wolf said. Ethan was briefly surprised. You heard about that? The performance community is small. Wolf said it neutrally. People talk. The story going around is that you found an intake leak in 40 minutes that 6 weeks of factory-certified diagnosis missed. He paused. I looked you up. Coles Automotive, Denton, small shop. Nothing on your background that explains that kind of result on a GT3RS. It was the kind of comment designed to prompt a defense. Ethan recognized the design and didn't engage with it. The result explains itself, he said. What can you tell me about the cold start hesitation? A beat. Something shifted in Wolf's expression. A small recalibration. He'd expected either a defensive response or an oversold one, and neither had arrived. All right, he said. Sit down and I'll tell you. They sat in the reception area. Wolf talked for 12 minutes, and Ethan let him talk without interrupting, because the first pass was always for the full picture and interruptions pruned it. Wolf was precise, as Marcus had indicated. He'd tracked the cold start hesitation in a notes app on his phone and had a date log going back 4 months. He could characterize the hesitation specifically, not a stumble, not an idle roughness, more like the engine took a shallow breath and then found its footing. It lasted between 15 and 30 seconds. It happened more frequently when the car had sat overnight in temperatures below 50 degrees. It had happened twice at parking lot temperatures above 60, but those instances were 6 weeks apart and might have been coincidental. When Wolf finished, Ethan said, Has the car had any fuel system service recently? Injectors, fuel pump, anything in the fuel delivery chain? Wolf said, The injectors were cleaned 18 months ago at a specialist, standard service. And how long after that did the cold start issue appear? Wolf was quiet. He pulled out his phone, scrolled. The first entry in my notes is 8 months ago. So 10 months after the injector service? Yes. Wolf looked up. You think the two are connected. I think high-pressure fuel injectors on a McLaren twin-turbo application are sensitive to the cleaning solution used and the procedure. If the wrong solvent was used or if the injector tips weren't properly flow-tested after cleaning, you can get a slight irregularity in the spray pattern that doesn't manifest at operating temperature because fuel viscosity changes. Cold start is when it shows up. The fuel is denser. The injector tip has to work harder to atomize it, and the irregular spray pattern creates a lean condition for the first few seconds. Wolf was very still. That's very specific. It's a known issue on this engine family, not common, but documented. He paused. I'd want to run a fuel injector flow test with a cold soak cycle before I say that's definitely it. But I want you to know what I'm looking for and why before I start. Wolf looked at him for a long moment. The measuring quality hadn't left his gaze, but it had shifted. From evaluating a person he was skeptical of to evaluating a person he was revising his assessment of, which were different activities. The other technicians, Wolf said carefully. When I brought the car in before, they didn't ask about the injector service. The intake process didn't have the questions that would have surfaced it, Ethan said. That's been corrected. By you. With Priya. She runs the intake desk. Wolf nodded once. It was a nod with weight in it. All right, he said. Run the flow test. The McLaren took 4 days. The cold soak flow test confirmed what Ethan had suspected. Injector 3 on the right bank was producing a marginally lean spray pattern at cold temperatures, measurable only when the fuel temperature was below 45 degrees and the viscosity was correspondingly higher. At operating temperature, the pattern normalized. At the threshold conditions Wolf had documented, it produced exactly the shallow breath hesitation he'd described. The injector required replacement. It was not a cheap fix. McLaren injectors were not cheap anything. But it was a discrete, specific repair with a clear diagnostic pathway, and Wolf approved it the same afternoon Ethan called with the finding. The call was brief, professional, nothing remarkable on the surface. But when Ethan said, We've scheduled the replacement for Monday and the car will be ready by Wednesday, Wolf said, after a pause, I want to say something. Ethan waited. I've been a client here for 2 years, Wolf said. And for the first time, I feel like someone actually heard what I was telling them about the car. Another pause. That shouldn't be an unusual experience, but it was. Ethan didn't make a production of it. You gave us good information, clear, organized, detailed. That made the diagnosis possible. I gave the same information before, Wolf said. Twice. The room was quiet for a moment. I know, Ethan said. We'll do better. He meant it plainly, not as a customer service line, and Wolf heard the difference. He said he'd see them Wednesday and hung up. Ethan sat at the desk for a moment after. The glass wall of his office looked out onto the service floor where Tyler was doing something with the McLaren's engine bay, with the particular focused care of someone who understood that the car he was working on cost more than most houses. The facility was running, vehicles moving through it, people doing their work, the machine of the operation turning over in the way it was supposed to. He thought about the intake form. The 8 new questions. The detail about the injector service that had been sitting in the diagnostic record the whole time, invisible, because nobody had asked the question that would have made it visible. Data stored but not analyzed. Complaints professionalized into categories. Information lost in translation. He'd said all of this to Vanessa in this same conference room 3 weeks before he'd even accepted the job. Now he was living inside the implementation of it, which was a different thing. Describing a gap was easy. Closing it was the actual work. Tja, the first time Vanessa came to him rather than the other way around was the end of week 4. He'd been in the facility long enough by then to understand the rhythms of her day. The early start she kept. The mid-morning block she cleared for the operational review that Marcus ran. The afternoon client calls. She moved through the facility differently than any other person in it. Not quickly exactly, but with a density of attention that made her presence notable without being disruptive. Staff noticed when she was near without being made nervous by it. She appeared in his office doorway at 4:15. He had the historical repair data open on his second monitor. He'd been building the pattern analysis tool he'd described in the conference room, working with a data entry contractor who came in 2 days a week, cross-referencing complaint types across vehicle families over the facility's 4-year record. What are you looking at? She said. McLaren owners report cold start issues at a higher rate than any other complaint category, proportionally to the brand's representation in the client base. He turned the monitor toward her. 3 separate clients in 2 years, all recorded as unresolved or intermittent. All of them, looking at the notes, had had fuel system service in the preceding 12 to 18 months. Vanessa came in and sat in the chair across from the desk. Not the visitor posture. She sat like someone who was there to work. Same injector issue as Wolf? I don't know yet. 2 of the 3 have resolved on their own, or appeared to, which means the problem might be intermittent enough that it went away temporarily and came back. I'm going to reach out to both owners next week, he paused. But if it's the same root cause, the injector cleaning protocol, then we have information we could share with the McLaren specialist community, a documented pattern. She was looking at the data. Something in her expression had the quality it sometimes got when she was thinking ahead. Not distracted, but extended. The look of someone running a parallel process. That's more than a maintenance note, she said. That's a technical contribution. It might be nothing. I need to talk to the other 2 owners first. But if it's something, yeah, it's worth writing up. She looked at him. This is what I hired you for, she said. Not effusively, just stating a fact. Not just finding the GT3's leak. This. He was uncomfortable with it in the specific way he'd been uncomfortable with her directness from the first meeting. Not because it was wrong, but because he'd never learned to receive certain things without deflecting them. The tool's half built, he said, and the contractor's only here twice a week, so the data entry is slow. Can we get him in 3 days a week? If the budget allows it, find out what it costs and send it to me. She stood up, pushed the chair back. And Ethan, he looked at her. Stop apologizing for work that's going well, she said. She left. He turned back to his monitor. The afternoon light was coming through the high windows of the service floor outside his glass wall, landing on the concrete in long rectangular blocks that shifted as the light moved. Tyler was walking through the floor with a clipboard. Marcus was visible in the service office above, standing at his workstation, talking to one of the technicians. Ethan thought about his father's workbench, the initials in the corner of the metal, RCE. He wondered, not for the first time, what Robert would have thought of this room, this desk, this version of his son's work. He thought he knew the answer. Not certainty, he'd never be certain, but the closest thing to it. His father would have sat in this chair, looked at the monitor, looked at the service floor through the glass, and said something like, "The machine's the same. The scale's just bigger." He would have said it dismissively, the way he said things that were actually compliments. And then he would have asked what the data tool was doing and wanted to understand every part of it, and argued with Ethan about 2 or 3 of the methodological choices and been right about one of them. Ethan almost smiled. He went back to the data. Oh, Lily came to the facility on a Saturday 3 weeks later. It wasn't planned. Carl had called Friday afternoon about a supplier issue at the shop that needed Ethan's signature on some documents, and Ethan had planned to drive to Denton Saturday morning, but Lily had a play date that fell through, and she'd been in the kitchen at 7 a.m. looking at him with the specific expression of a person with nothing to do and no good options, which he recognized from the inside. "You want to come with me?" he said. "I have to go to the shop for an hour, and then I was going to stop by the facility." She'd considered this the way she considered everything that required weighing. "Will Vanessa Sterling be there?" "Maybe. It's Saturday. I'm not sure." "Okay," Lily said. The stop at Kohl's went smoothly. Carl was there, unhurried, the shop looking as it had always looked, but with Carl's organizational tendency beginning to show in small ways. The tool cart in Bay 1 had been repositioned slightly. The invoicing pile on Sandra's desk was organized differently. Not better, not worse. Just Carl's version of the same space. Ethan signed the documents and stood in Bay 2 for a minute and felt none of the things he'd been afraid he might feel. It was just a shop, doing its work, with a different person's hands on it now. Lily stood at his father's workbench and ran her fingers along the wooden surface. She didn't say anything. She'd been in this shop hundreds of times. She had her own relationship with the room that Ethan didn't fully know. Carl brought her a soda from the mini-fridge, which she accepted with formal solemnity. "Your dad says the new place is good," Carl told her. "He doesn't say much about it," Lily said, "but he's less tired." Carl looked at Ethan over her head. Ethan looked at his daughter, who had delivered this observation without apparent awareness of what it contained. "Less tired is good," Carl said. "Yeah," Lily agreed. She drank her soda. At the facility, Vanessa was there. She came out of her office when she heard them in the main entrance. It was a Saturday skeleton crew, quieter than the week. She was in jeans and a plain dark jacket, her hair up in the loose way she wore it when she wasn't in meetings. She stopped when she saw Lily. Lily looked at her with the careful, direct attention she gave to new people. "This is my daughter," Ethan said. "Lily, Bug, this is Vanessa." "I know," Lily said. "You have the car." Vanessa looked at her. "The GT3RS, yes." "The one my dad fixed." "The one your dad fixed," Vanessa agreed. There was something in her expression when she looked at Lily that Ethan couldn't fully read. Something that moved across her face briefly, unguarded. "Do you want to see it?" Lily looked at Ethan. He shrugged. She looked back at Vanessa. "Yeah," she said. They walked to the bay where the GT3RS lived between track days. Vanessa opened the bay door and flipped the light, and the car appeared in it. Shark blue metallic, its wide body stance filling the space, the kind of presence that even Ethan, who had seen it several times now, registered on some level below calculation. Lily walked up to it and stopped at a respectful distance. She looked at it for a long time, then, "Where was the loose clamp?" Vanessa pointed. "On the intake side, the passenger side of the engine toward the front." Lily walked around to that side of the car, stood next to the fender and looked in at the engine bay. "And that's what was making it stumble?" "Yes." "A loose clamp." Lily turned this over. "And your computers didn't find it." "They looked for it," Vanessa said, "but it was smaller than what they were designed to detect." Lily nodded slowly, with the gravity that sometimes appeared on her face and that Ethan thought of as inherited from his father. "Grandpa said that machines tell you the truth," she said, "but you have to listen, not just measure." The bay was very quiet. Vanessa looked at Lily for a moment, then at Ethan. Her expression had the quality it got when something had landed specifically, not dramatically, just with a weight she was letting register rather than moving past. "He was right," Vanessa said. "I know," Lily said simply. She looked back at the car. "It's really blue." Ethan laughed. It was a real one, short and sudden, the kind that arrived before you decided to let it. Vanessa smiled, and it was the full version, not the professional version, which he'd seen a few times now, but not many. "It is very blue," Vanessa agreed. They stood in the bay together for a while, the three of them, in the particular quiet of a weekend morning when there was no urgency and no schedule, and the machines around them were just machines. Beautiful, complex, knowable things, built by human hands and understood by human attention and at rest in the light. Lily eventually asked if she could sit in the car. Vanessa said yes. Lily opened the door with careful reverence and climbed into the driver's seat and put both hands on the steering wheel and sat there with perfect seriousness, as though she were preparing for something that required her full concentration. Ethan stood next to Vanessa and watched. "She's like you," Vanessa said quietly. Not a question. "She's like my father," Ethan said, "more than she knows." Vanessa looked at the kid in the car, at the way she sat with the wheel, alert and serious and entirely inside the moment she was in. "Maybe both," she said. He didn't answer, but he didn't disagree. Lily sat in the car for 4 minutes, then climbed out and thanked Vanessa with the formal courtesy she reserved for people she'd decided to treat as worthy of it. Vanessa told her she was welcome to come back anytime she wanted to see the car. Lily said she might take her up on that, in a tone that indicated this was not a polite response but an actual statement of intent. Walking back to the truck, Lily said, "She's not how I thought she'd be." "What did you think she'd be like?" Lily thought about it. "Fancier," she said. "Farther away, like she wouldn't notice me." "And she wasn't?" "She noticed me," Lily said. She climbed in the truck and buckled herself and pulled out her book. "That matters." He started the truck, backed out, pointed them toward home. He thought about noticing, as an act, as a form of attention, as the beginning of understanding anything. He'd spent 20 years learning how to notice machines. His father had taught him that the first act of diagnosis was paying attention, really paying attention, not just running the protocol, not just reading the data, but actually turning your full awareness toward the thing in front of you and asking it to tell you something. He'd been hired by Vanessa Sterling because he knew how to notice what machines were telling him. What he hadn't expected was that the same facility where he'd learned to build that practice at scale was also the place where he'd find, slowly and imperfectly, that the same attention worked on people too. On Priya and the forms that gave her a better tool. On Tyler and the detail he'd gotten from a phone call he hadn't put in the report. On Marcus and the space between expertise and pride that a person had to navigate without damaging either. On Garrison Wolfe, who had given the same information twice and been heard on the third time. On Lily, who had sat in a car that cost $300,000 with the same seriousness she brought to everything, and who had noticed, with the unerring accuracy of children, that the woman who owned it was the kind of person who noticed people back. The road home was the same road, the truck was the same truck, but something in the quality of the drive was different from the drives of 3 months ago. Not because the destination had changed, but because the ground under it had shifted, and he was standing on it differently now, with both feet, with some actual purchase. It was not a feeling of arrival. He was not that naive. It was a feeling of being, at last, fully in motion. The McLaren pattern report took 6 weeks to build properly. Ethan had called the other 2 owners, a man named Patrick Sue, who ran a real estate investment firm and kept his 720S in a climate-controlled garage, and a woman named Helen Breckett, who had put 60,000 miles on her 5.7 GT and treated it with the practical affection of someone who actually drove the thing rather than preserved it. Both had described cold start behavior that matched Wolfe's documentation with the particular precision of people who'd been trying to get someone to listen for longer than they should have had to. Patrick Sue had given up. He'd accepted the intermittent hesitation as a known quirk, something the car did, a personality trait rather than a fault. He'd mentioned it at 2 service appointments, and both times had been told the computer showed nothing. The third time he hadn't mentioned it because he'd learned there was no point. Helen Breckett had a different response when Ethan called. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Finally," in a tone that carried the full weight of a year and a half of being told her perception was wrong. He drove to see both cars in person, not because he didn't trust their descriptions. He did, but because the report needed to be built on observed data, not just owner testimony. He borrowed the facility's cold-soak test kit, drove to Patrick Sue's garage on a Tuesday when the overnight temperature had dropped to 41 degrees, and ran the flow test on the 720S in the same methodical way he'd run it on Wolf's car. Injector 6, right bank. Same lean spray pattern at cold temperature. Cleaner than Wolf's, less deteriorated, probably because the 720S had lower mileage, but the same fingerprint. Helen Breckett's 570 GT had it on injectors 2 and 5, both sides. Hers was the worst of the three, consistent with the mileage and the fact that she'd been driving through the symptom rather than around it. He sat in the parking lot of a gas station on the way back from Helen Breckett's house and wrote the preliminary findings in his phone's notes app, the same app he'd been using since before he had a desk to sit at. Then he drove back to the facility and spent 4 evenings building the actual report. Not a complaint, not a memo, a technical document. 3 cases, documented cold soak flow data, identified root cause, probable mechanism, recommended repair protocol, and a note at the end about the cleaning solution contraindication that the injector service specialist had missed. He sent it to Vanessa on a Thursday morning with a subject line that said, "McLaren cold start pattern, draft for review." She called him 20 minutes later. "This is good," she said. It was her direct voice, not the evaluative one, just a statement of fact. "This needs to go somewhere besides my inbox." "I was thinking the McLaren technical community," he said. "There are specialist forums. It might also be worth a note to the service department at the regional McLaren dealer, not as a complaint, just as a data share." "Do both," she said, "and put the facility's name on it." He'd expected to have to make that case. The absence of needing to made him realize, not for the first time, that part of working for Vanessa Sterling was learning to stop pre-negotiating concessions she wasn't planning to withhold. "I'll clean it up this week," he said. "One more thing." A pause. "Wolf called me yesterday." Ethan waited. "He said he's referring 3 clients to the facility, specifically because of his experience with you." Another pause. "He's not a man who makes referrals easily. I've known him for 2 years, and this is the first time." Ethan didn't say anything immediately. The weight of it landed without fanfare, which was the right way for things like this to land. "He gave us good information," Ethan said. "We used it." "Ethan." Her voice had the same edge it had gotten in the conference room when she'd told him to stop the modest deflection. "Yes." "And you built the system that used it. Those are related things." He sat with that for a moment. "Okay," he said. "I hear you." "Good." He could hear her moving, walking somewhere, the particular sound of her heels on the facility's concrete floor. "Clean up the report. Send it out this week." She hung up. He turned back to the monitor. The report went out on a Friday. By Monday morning, it had generated 47 responses on the specialist forum, including 2 from McLaren-certified technicians in other states who confirmed they'd seen similar patterns and hadn't connected them to the cleaning solution protocol. By Wednesday, it had been reposted in 2 other enthusiast communities. A week later, a technical writer from a performance automotive publication sent Ethan a message asking if he'd be willing to be interviewed for a piece on diagnostic methodology in high-performance service. He said he'd think about it. He thought about it for 3 days. Then he said yes, because Vanessa had told him to stop pre-negotiating concessions that nobody was withholding, and that applied to his own instincts too. The piece ran 6 weeks later. It was not a profile. He'd made that clear going in. It was a methodology piece, focused on the intake diagnostic process and the gap between sensor-based and observation-based diagnosis. His name was in it, and so was the facility's. Vanessa sent him a message the morning it went live that said, "Good piece, accurate. The phone is already busier, no exclamation point, no production, just the fact." Marcus stopped by his office that afternoon. He stood in the doorway with the look of a man who had something to say, and was determining the best way to say it. "The piece is good," Marcus said. "Thanks. It describes a methodology gap accurately." He paused. "I want you to know that I've been thinking about the system we've built over the past 3 months. What it took to build it. What it required from the team." Ethan waited. "I was resistant when you arrived," Marcus said. "Not irrationally. I had reasons. But I want to acknowledge that the resistance was also partly about—" He stopped. Started again. "I built this operation carefully. I was proud of it. And then someone walked in and found something in 40 minutes that 6 weeks of my careful operation hadn't found. That's a specific kind of thing to process." "I know," Ethan said. "What I've come to understand is that what you found wasn't a failure of my operation. It was a gap in the methodology the operation was built on. Those are different things." Marcus looked at him directly. "I should have known about smoke testing for microleaks on high-performance intakes. That's on me. I didn't, and now I do, and the operation is better for it." It was the most personal thing Marcus had said in 3 months of working together. Ethan recognized it as what it was, a man of precision and pride choosing honesty over the comfort of a simpler narrative. "For what it's worth," Ethan said, "the operation you built is what made it possible to build the next layer. The foundation was solid. That's not nothing, that's most of the work." Marcus nodded once, twice, the way he nodded when he was actually absorbing something rather than acknowledging it. "Right," he said. He pushed off the doorframe. "I'll see you at the morning review." He walked back toward the service office. Ethan watched him go and thought that whatever had just been said in that doorway had settled something between them that had been slightly unsettled since the first Saturday, since the smoke machine and the thin wisp of white in the engine bay, and Marcus's expression processing the failure his system hadn't caught. People were complicated. Workplaces were complicated. The idea that competence and compatibility were the same thing was something you stopped believing the first time you worked alongside someone who was both excellent and genuinely difficult to work with. Marcus was not difficult. He was precise and proud and took a few months to trust, and now that the trust was built, it was the durable kind, the kind built on evidence rather than goodwill. That was worth more in the long run. It was in the 5th month that the thing happened that Ethan hadn't expected. Not because he should have been surprised by it in principle, but because he'd been too focused on the work to see it coming in practice. He was in the conference room with Vanessa going through the quarterly review. His first one, a formal sit-down with data and numbers and a conversation about where the diagnostic quality program stood relative to the goals she'd set for it. The numbers were good. Not dramatically good, not ahead of every projection. The data analysis tool was still incomplete. The historical pattern work was going to take another 2 quarters to reach the depth he wanted, but the movement was in the right direction. Resolution rates on diagnostic complaints were up. Unresolved returns were down. 3 new major accounts had come in through referral in the past 60 days. Wolf's 3 plus 2 more who'd read the publication piece. She'd been walking him through the financial impact section. She did this efficiently, no editorializing, just the numbers and the context. When she set the papers down and said, "I want to talk about something else," he looked at her. "I want to expand the program," she said. "Not incrementally, structurally. What you've built here, the intake methodology, the pattern analysis, the diagnostic quality layer, I want to build it as a replicable system, something that can be licensed or franchised to other high-performance service facilities." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a different kind of thing from running a service division." "Yes." "That's a business development question. I'm not a business person." "You keep saying what you're not," she said, which is interesting because most people oversell themselves in that direction. "I'm trying to give you an accurate picture." "Here's my accurate picture," she said. "You came in here 5 months ago with a worn toolbox and an ability to hear things other people missed. In 5 months, you've rebuilt the intake process, reduced unresolved diagnostic complaints by 31%, documented a technical finding that's now being cited in the specialist community, and brought in 4 major new accounts through reputation alone." She paused. "You are, functionally, already doing business development. You're just not calling it that." He turned the coffee cup on the table. "Once. The habit of it, the small thing his hands did when his mind was working. If I'm honest, he said carefully, I don't know what licensing a methodology looks like. I don't know how you build that. I know how to diagnose cars and I know how to teach other people to diagnose cars. Whether that translates to a scalable product, I don't know. I do, she said. That's not your piece. Your piece is building the methodology to the point where it can be documented clearly enough to be taught to people who didn't grow up listening to their father's workbench. She leaned forward slightly. Can you do that? The honest answer was that he didn't know, but the honest answer to that was that not knowing wasn't the same as no. I can try, he said. That's all I'm asking. She picked up her papers. And Ethan, the title changes. Director of Diagnostic Development. The compensation changes with it. He looked at her. You don't have to keep... I'm not doing you a favor, she said flatly. I'm pricing a contribution accurately. Those are different things, and I need you to understand the difference. He thought about his father, who had worked 41 years in 2 bays for the income those 2 bays could support, and who had been good, genuinely, exceptionally good, at what he did, and who had never had anyone sit across from him and tell him that his contribution had a specific value and that value should be reflected in what he was paid. Robert Cole had not been underpaid by exploitation. He'd been underpaid by invisibility, by working in a space where what he did was contained and therefore what he was worth was contained, and nobody had ever found a larger frame for it. Ethan thought about that, about what it meant to be seen at a scale that matched what you actually were. Okay, he said. Thank you. She nodded, picked up her pen. The documentation project starts next week. I want a first draft framework in 90 days. She paused. And yes, you still leave at 2:45. That's not a discussion. He almost smiled. I wasn't going to argue. I know, she said, but I wanted to say it first. Checked. The 90-day framework became, in practice, 112 days because that was how documentation projects went, and neither of them had been naive enough to think otherwise. What Ethan built in those 112 days was a thing he was genuinely proud of, which was not a feeling he had often about abstract work. He was used to being proud of specific diagnoses, specific repairs, specific moments where the problem and the solution lined up. This was different. This was a system on paper, a set of principles and practices and intake protocols and escalation pathways, organized well enough that a competent technician at a different facility in a different state could read it and understand not just what to do, but why. The why was the hard part. The what, the intake form questions, the escalation triggers, the pattern analysis structure, those were documented. The why required translating something that Ethan had mostly operated from instinct, from years of his father's voice and his own accumulated hours, into language that didn't require you to have grown up in a repair shop to understand. He rewrote the opening section 3 times. The first version was too technical. It read like a manual, which was what he'd instinctively reached for. The second version overcorrected and became something closer to a philosophy essay, which Vanessa read and said diplomatically, "This is interesting, but it's not a framework." The third version found something closer to the middle, practical, specific, grounded in examples from the facility's actual cases. The GT3 RS, the RS6 with the vibration in the seat, the McLaren cold start pattern, and reaching upward from those specific instances toward the general principle. The general principle, stated as plainly as he could manage it, was this: diagnostic technology tells you what it can measure. Diagnostic skill tells you what to look for in the space between measurements. Both are required. Neither is sufficient alone. Vanessa read the completed framework on a Thursday afternoon in January, which was 8 months after Ethan's first day. She read the whole thing, 43 pages, without stopping, which he knew because he'd sent it at 1 in the afternoon and she'd called at 4:15. "It's right," she said. "There are parts I'd revise." "There are always parts you'd revise." "It's right." A pause. "I'm taking this to 3 facility owners I know next month. I want you in the room when I do." He thought about this, about a version of himself standing in front of other professionals, other facilities, presenting a methodology that had started with a loose clamp in an intake system and a man with a beat-up red toolbox. The gap between those two things seemed large and also, somehow, not. "Okay," he said. "Thank you for this," she said. "It was simple and it was real." "Thank you for seeing it before I did," he said, which was also simple and real. She said she'd send meeting invites for the facility visits. She hung up. He sat at the desk that still faintly smelled like new furniture 8 months later and looked out through the glass wall at the service floor. The afternoon crew was winding down, Tyler doing a final inspection on a customer vehicle, 2 of the other technicians finishing up paperwork, the quiet, productive hum of people who'd done good work and were finishing their day. He thought about the first time he'd stood in this building on a Saturday morning with the red toolbox in his hand, listening to an engine that knew something nobody else had been able to hear yet. The machine always told the truth. You just had to be willing to hear something you didn't expect. It was a Tuesday in late January when Ethan found the thing that had been sitting in the historical data for 3 years. He hadn't been looking for it specifically. He was running a review of the pattern analysis tool, which the data contractor had finished building 3 weeks before, and which was now pulling real trends from the 4-year repair record, rather than just the preliminary samples he'd been working from manually. He was looking at frequency distributions across vehicle families, the kind of broad pattern scan you ran to see if anything jumped. Something jumped. 3 vehicles, all 2018 to 2020 model year, all high-performance V8 applications, all presented with intermittent rough running under sustained high load. All had been through the facility at least twice. All had been diagnosed with the same recorded outcome: no fault confirmed, intermittent complaint, return to customer. All 3 had come back a third time with more significant symptoms. 2 with confirmed ignition system faults, 1 with a fuel delivery failure, and had been repaired at significant cost. He pulled the full repair histories, looked at the intake notes from the original visits, the first and second presentations before the faults became major. Read them carefully. All 3 original intake notes described the symptom the same way, in different words. Rough running under sustained high load, not present at lower RPM, not present intermittently, only under sustained high engine demand. All 3 had been diagnosed with standard protocol. No fault confirmed, returned. He read the notes from the third presentations, when the faults had become undeniable. In all 3 cases, the root cause was thermal, heat-related degradation in the ignition system that only manifested under the specific conditions of sustained high-load operation. The kind of fault that built slowly, degraded incrementally, and presented with exactly the intermittent high-load symptom that all 3 owners had reported from the beginning. They'd been telling the facility the right thing from the first visit. The facility hadn't had a way to hear it. He built the case documentation in 2 hours. It wasn't complicated once the pattern was visible. It was actually simple. The clarity that came after you'd found the thing you were looking for, and the data organized itself around the finding. Thermal degradation under sustained load, presenting as rough running before full failure. The early presentations dismissed because standard protocol at ambient temperature didn't replicate the conditions under which the fault was active. He brought it to Marcus before he brought it to Vanessa. That was the protocol, and the protocol was right. Marcus read the documentation carefully. He was quiet for longer than he usually was, which meant something was working in him that required the quiet. Then he said, "These 3 clients." 2 are still active accounts, Ethan said. 1 stopped coming in after the 3rd visit. I checked. Marcus set the papers down. The one who stopped coming in. Gerald Marsh, 2019 Corvette Z06. He brought it in twice with the rough running complaint, got 2 no-fault results, and then had a full ignition coil failure on the highway 3 months later. He had it repaired elsewhere. I found an email in the archive where he told Priya, the previous intake person, before our new process, that he'd decided to go to a different facility. Marcus absorbed that. He had a legitimate complaint from the start. Yes, and we returned his car twice without finding it. Without finding it, Ethan said. Not without looking. The methodology at the time couldn't detect a thermal fault at ambient temperature. That's not negligence, it's a limitation. He paused. But it's still a limitation we should have known about. Marcus was quiet again. Then, "What do you want to do with this?" I want to add a sustained high-load diagnostic protocol to the standard process for this family of symptoms, something that replicates operating temperature conditions on the dyno before concluding no fault found. He looked at Marcus. And I think we should contact Gerald Marsh. Marcus looked at him. To say what? To tell him that we've identified a pattern that explains what his car was doing when he brought it in, and that we're sorry we didn't have the methodology to find it then. He held Marcus's gaze. Not to offer him compensation, not to open a liability conversation, just to tell him the truth. There was a long silence. Vanessa will need to be part of that conversation, Marcus said. I know. She might not want to open that door. She might not, Ethan agreed, but I think she will. He was right. He brought the documentation to Vanessa's office that afternoon and laid it out in the same plain way he'd laid out everything. Here's what I found. Here's what it means. Here's what I think we should do. She read it without interrupting. Asked 2 questions. Read the Gerald Marsh section twice. Then she said, call him, from me. I'll draft the message. You review it. Make sure it's technically accurate. We tell him what happened, and we tell him what we've changed. No offer of compensation? That depends on how he responds. She looked at Ethan. But we start with the truth. We don't start with a settlement offer. That's not honesty. That's risk management dressed as honesty. He looked at her. That's the right call. I know it is, she said. I also know it's uncomfortable, which is usually how you tell the right call from the convenient one. Gerald Marsh called back 2 days after they sent the message. He was not warm. He was careful, the measured tone of someone who'd been disappointed and was protecting himself from being disappointed again. He listened to Vanessa's explanation, asked specific questions that Ethan, on the call beside her, answered directly. At the end, Marsh said, I appreciate you telling me. That's not... He stopped. That's not what I expected. We should have found it earlier, Vanessa said. I'm sorry we didn't. A pause. What changed? We hired someone who changed the way we listen to problems, Vanessa said. She looked at Ethan when she said it, and he looked back, and neither of them made anything more of the moment than it was. Marsh said he'd think about bringing his next car to the facility. Not a commitment, just an opening. That was enough. On a Friday in February, Ethan left work at 2:43, which was 2 minutes earlier than usual because Tyler had stopped by his office at 2:40 to ask about a diagnostic question, and the question had a quick answer, and Ethan had given it, and been in his truck by 2:43 and pulling out of the facility lot at 2:45 on the nose. He picked Lily up at 3:17, which was 2 minutes late because the bus was 2 minutes late, but he was there when she came down the steps, and she saw him before she'd finished the last step, and her face did the thing. She climbed in, buckled herself, dropped the backpack, did not immediately pull out the book. What's going on? He said. Nothing bad. She looked out the window for a moment. We had a writing assignment today. About someone we admire. He pulled away from the curb. Yeah? I wrote about Grandpa. He drove. The afternoon was pale and clear, the kind of February day that was cold but honest about it, the light thin and bright. What did you write? He said. That he taught you how to listen to engines, and that you taught me that listening is how you understand things. She paused, and that understanding things is more important than just knowing things. He thought about that for a while, about the difference between knowing and understanding, and whether his father had known that was the thing he was teaching, or whether it was just what came through when you paid attention to a man who paid attention. Did your teacher like it? He said. She said it was mature for my age. Lily considered this. I think that's a compliment. It is. She asked who taught me that. The thing about understanding versus knowing. She pulled out the book. I told her you did. He drove. The road was the road it always was. The truck smelled like the shop, and a little like the facility now, 2 different kinds of work sharing the same space. The red toolbox was in the bed, as it always was. He thought about his father's initials in the corner of the workbench. RCE, scratched into metal 40 years ago by a man who was building something that would outlast him, though he probably didn't know that was what he was doing. You rarely knew, when you were building something that would outlast you, that that was what you were doing. You just built it carefully. You paid attention. You told the truth about what you found. The rest was what it was. 8 months after Ethan's first day at Sterling Performance Facility, Vanessa stood in front of 3 facility owners in a conference room in Dallas, Texas, and presented the diagnostic methodology framework that she and Ethan had built. One of the owners was a woman in her late 40s who ran a BMW specialist operation in Colorado. One was a man who owned 2 Porsche-focused service centers in Florida. The third was a facility owner from outside Seattle whose background was in motorsport. Ethan sat to Vanessa's left. He had not wanted to be at the front of the room, which she'd acknowledged and then ignored. She presented the framework the way she presented everything, directly, with specificity, without overselling it. She laid out what it was: a systematic approach to the gap between sensor-based and observation-based diagnosis. She laid out what it had produced at the facility: the numbers, the cases, the Marsh situation, and its outcome. She laid out what it required: not equipment, not technology, but a specific orientation in how technical staff related to the machines they worked on. Then she said, "The person who built this is Ethan Cole. He can answer your questions better than I can." She sat down. The BMW specialist from Colorado leaned forward. Her name was Linda Yee, and she had the precise, evaluative energy of someone who'd spent 20 years being underestimated and had stopped having patience for performance. "The intake methodology," she said, looking at Ethan. "The 8-question protocol. How long did it take your advisor to internalize it?" 2 weeks before she was using it fluently, Ethan said. 6 weeks before she was improving it, adding follow-up questions the protocol hadn't anticipated. "She's still with you?" "Yes." "Did she resist the change?" He thought about Priya and the 40 uninterrupted minutes of pent-up professional observation she'd delivered when given the actual opportunity to contribute. "No," he said. She'd been frustrated with the existing form for a year and a half. She'd just been waiting for someone to ask. Linda Yee nodded slowly. "That's the part I'm most interested in," she said. "The permission structure, not the form. The form is a form. The act of telling the person who takes the intake that their judgment about what's relevant is actually valuable." "That's exactly right," Ethan said. "The form is just the structure. The change is in who gets to be part of the diagnosis." Linda Yee wrote something in her notebook. The man from Florida, whose name was Ray Dominguez, asked about the pattern analysis tool, the data architecture, the query logic, the maintenance. These were detailed technical questions, and Ethan answered them in detail. And somewhere in the middle of the third answer, he realized he was not performing competence, was not constructing a version of himself for the room. He was just talking about the work, the actual work, the way he talked about it with Marcus or with Tyler or with Lily at the dinner table when she asked how his day went. That was the only way it worked, the only thing that held up over time. Just the actual thing, said plainly. The meeting went 2.5 hours. All 3 owners said they wanted to discuss licensing terms. Vanessa handled those conversations. That was her piece, the one she'd told him wasn't his, and he listened and said what was accurate when accuracy was needed and let her drive what she was built to drive. On the drive back, they stopped for food at a roadside diner that was halfway between Dallas and home, because neither of them had eaten since morning, and the next stop was 3 hours away. It was an undistinguished place with good coffee and a menu that had been the same for 15 years. They sat in a booth by the window, and outside the highway ran flat into a horizon that had gone orange with the late sun. Vanessa ordered coffee and eggs. Ethan ordered the same. They were quiet for a while in the way that people were quiet when the day's work was done and the quiet was earned. "Linda Yee is going to sign," Vanessa said. "I thought so." "Ray Dominguez probably will. The Seattle one I'm less sure about. He asked good questions." "People who ask good questions and don't sign are the most frustrating kind," she said. "But 2 out of 3 is a start." The coffee arrived. She wrapped both hands around the mug. He did the same, and there was something in the shared gesture. The ordinary, unremarkable thing of 2 people holding their coffee the same way at the same table. That was its own small kind of comfort. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited. "My father," she said, then stopped. She looked at the window, at the flat orange horizon. He taught me the same thing yours did. Not about engines, about machines generally. He fixed HVAC. He always said that when something breaks, you don't ignore it. You find it. You fix it. She turned the mug in her hands. I spent 6 weeks being told nothing was wrong with my car, and I knew they were wrong because he'd taught me that things are either working or they're not, and something that isn't working is something that needs to be found. Ethan looked at her. I knew you were the right person, not because of the GT3, she said. I knew because of how you talked about your father's tools, the way you said they had a feel to them. She paused. That's not a mechanical observation. That's someone who understands that the knowledge of a thing isn't always in data. He sat with that. The highway outside moved with the occasional passing car, brief lights in the dusk. What happened to your father? He said. He died when I was 24. Heart attack. Very fast. She said it the way you said something you'd had years to make peace with. Not without weight, but with the weight distributed evenly enough to carry. He didn't get to see any of the facility. Any of this. What would he think of it? She almost smiled. He would ask very specific questions about how I handled the HVAC system in the main bay, and then he would argue with whoever I'd hired about the thermostat placement. She looked at Ethan, and then he would walk around the whole place with his hands in his pockets, the way he did when he was actually impressed by something, and he would not say that he was impressed, but I would know. Ethan understood that. He understood it completely. My father's the same, he said. Was the same. The tense still caught him sometimes, the small jolt of the correction. He would have walked through that facility with his arms crossed and looked at the equipment and found at least 2 things to critique and not said a word about the rest. And you would have known. I would have known. The food arrived. They ate. Outside, the orange deepened and the first stars appeared in the far east of the sky, dim and certain. There was nothing resolved in the way that stories sometimes resolved. No single moment where everything was suddenly and completely clear. What there was instead was the accumulated weight of a year of work that had moved something in multiple directions that had been standing still. Vanessa's facility was better than it had been. The diagnostic gap was smaller. 3 McLaren owners had answers they'd needed for a year. Gerald Marsh knew the truth of what had happened to his car. Linda Yee was probably going to take the framework back to Colorado and use it on BMWs. And in doing so, other people's problems would be found faster. The machines would tell their truths to ears that had been trained to hear. And Ethan had a desk that didn't smell like new furniture anymore. He had a role that fit the actual size of what he was. He had a daughter who was 9 now and still sat on the passenger side of the truck and read books and occasionally looked up to ask about his day with the clear, direct attention that was the best thing he knew. He had his father's toolbox in the corner of the kitchen, as he always had, as he probably always would. He had, somehow, without planning for it, built a life that was larger than the one he'd been living, not because the old life had been wrong, but because it had been a beginning rather than a destination, and he'd been standing in it like it was finished. That spring, Ethan drove to Cole's Automotive on a Saturday morning for the first time in months, not for any specific reason. Carl had the operation well in hand, Sandra was there, the shop was running. He drove there because he wanted to. He stood in Bay 1 with a cup of coffee and looked at the space. Carl had repainted the sign. Cole's Automotive, honest work, fair price, fresh block letters, same text. The concrete apron out front still had the old oil stain in the right front position. Some things were not worth removing. Some things were records. He stood at his father's workbench, put his hand flat on the wooden surface, felt the particular texture of it. The grain worn smooth in the places his father's hands had worn it smooth, 40 years of the same motions, the same placement. His father's initials were still in the corner of the metal, RCE. He stood there for a while, not grieving exactly, not celebrating, just being present in the place where one thing had become another, where his father's life had handed off to his own life, where the work had continued under a different pair of hands. A machine always told you the truth. You just had to be willing to be still enough to hear it. He finished his coffee, set the cup on the workbench, drove home. Lily was in the backyard when he got there, sitting in the grass with her book and a pile of iron-on patches that she was theoretically organizing and practically just touching one by one, deciding something about each of them that had its own internal logic he couldn't follow. She looked up when he came through the gate. "How was the shop?" she said. "Good," he said. "Same." She held up a patch, an iron-on of a small red wrench. "Can I put this one on my backpack?" He looked at it. "Yeah, bug, put it on." She set it down carefully in the yes pile, with the considered deliberateness of someone making a permanent decision about a small thing, which was how permanent decisions about small things deserved to be made. He sat in the grass next to her, in the April sunlight, and there was nothing more to say, and nothing more was needed, and that was the whole of it.